On Sunday afternoon, March 6, 2011, on the campus of the University of Colorado in Boulder, Colorado, investigative journalist Chris Mohr squared off with veteran architect Richard Gage, AIA, in a debate about what really happened at the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Chris Mohr is an advocate of the natural collapse theory, which says that all three skyscrapers came down as a result of the jet plane impacts and resulting fires. Richard Gage, founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, argued that the natural collapse theory is impossible and that all the evidence points to a controlled demolition. The debate was moderated by Tom Kiley of INN World Report and organized by members of Colorado 9/11 Visibility. This debate was structured in two parts. Part 1 features arguments concerning the collapse of the Twin Towers, and Part 2 concentrates on the mysterious collapse of World Trade Center 7. We begin this audio presentation with Part 1 of 9/11 Debate, Collapse by Fire or Explosive Controlled Demolition, featuring Chris Mohr and Richard Gage debating what happened to the Twin Towers.
We are fortunate to have two such passionate truth seekers here today to make their cases to us. In a sense, they embody the division this topic makes through our society, oftentimes in unexpected ways. One of our debaters here today is a self-described Ronald Reagan Republican. The other a pacifist and peace activist who has protested against American foreign policy many times. Yet here today it is Richard Gage, the Republican, who is challenging the government's report, and Chris Mohr, the peace activist, who is disputing Richard's position. However different they are in their approaches to life, politics, and this issue, they are united in their sincerity when pursuing the truth. And for that, we thank them for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Okay. Now then, we are going to have, as I said, the first segment here focusing on the collapses of the Twin Towers in New York on September the 11th, 2001. We are going to start off with Mr. Chris Mohr. Chris, please take 10 minutes to make your opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, for coming out from New York for this, and thank you for the audience. And I'm also very grateful to all the volunteers who it was a real labor of love to put this together, and I'm grateful for all the respect I've received in the preparation for this. And so I want to start for all of you in the audience with an outrageous request, and that is that you suspend your beliefs just for this evening, whatever your beliefs are, and just listen. Listen even more carefully to the person you most disagree with, and that is not easy. There's a famous attitude polarization study that goes back to 1979 that shows that when people are presented with views that both oppose and support their own, it's almost always strengthening their existing beliefs. So resist that. And allow yourself to really ask, are the things that are being shown to me today true? Is this the whole story, or is it just the part that I want to show you, or is it just the part that Richard wants to show you? And I can demonstrate for you how challenging this is with a little trick to get us started here. Here are 6 cards, and I'd like you to please choose one of these cards and fix it in your mind, because now I'm going to remove that card. Oops. Let me come back up here, sorry. So there I have removed the card, and if this is a new trick for you, chances are that you didn't notice that all of the cards in the second part are actually a little bit different from the cards in the first one. We have a mental power, pretty much every one of us, just by being human beings, to assume that the other cards are the same, and that blinds us to the truth of what is right in front of our eyes. We all have certain core, uninvestigated assumptions. We often see what we assume what we will see. This evening you're going to see edited videos. I've put some together. I put some slides together. Richard has done exactly the same thing. And we want you to see certain things, and we hope that you will see those things. But be careful, because you may see only what it is that you want to see. Seeing is believing, but believing is also seeing, is what I'm trying to warn you about. Here's an accusation that I'm afraid applies to almost everybody in the world. It's a very, very common thing. MIT professor Thomas Eagar was talking about people in the 9/11 Truth Movement, but I think it applies to a lot of people in a lot of other worlds as well. He said, quote, "These people use reverse scientific method. They determine what happened, throw out all the data that doesn't fit their conclusion, and then hail their findings as the only possible conclusion." Now, I don't want to start that as an attack specifically against the 9/11 truth movement at all, but both sides do tend to do this. I've tried to look at both sides to find out what initiated this collapse. I've read dozens of expert explanations. I watched several 9/11 videos. I almost got actually convinced by Richard's video, which I think is the best one out there, frankly. I dug up original, complete eyewitness interviews. I joined an online science Q&A club. I read 1,000 pages of the NIST report before I fell asleep permanently. I asked some really tough questions directly, though, of NIST. I called them up. I talked to them for about 4 hours altogether, 4 different people. They've also given me written answers to some tough questions. Chemist Kevin Ryan, who is very much a part of the 9/11 truth movement, I talked to him. Former controlled demolition employee Tom Sullivan. I've asked over a dozen technically trained people to try to stop for a moment and answer these questions for me. One of them, by the way, was a certified structural engineer from New York who believes in 9/11 complicity, but he does not believe in controlled demolition. So I want to talk a little bit about why buildings are built first. We're going to start with the pyramids of ancient Egypt. The pharaohs wanted an immortal home, so they wanted it to be really strong. And the architects said, "Okay, boss," and several thousand years later, these buildings are still standing. That's not the same with capitalists. They are motivated to minimize expense, maximize profit, fulfill the building code, and make the renters feel safe, make it pretty, but that's it. Mostly what they want is office space to rent. So the architects say, "Okay, boss, hundreds of slender, hollow steel support columns around the outside, a strong core with less than usual concrete support, spray-painted fireproofing on the steel supports instead to lighten up the structure, required structural redundancies to hold 3 times its weight. But the main thing, boss, is it's going to be 95% air by volume, almost 220 acres of floor space in the Twin Towers, almost 1 full acre per floor, mostly rentable. We'll also make it beautiful in a modern kind of a way by putting aluminum cladding from Alcoa on the outside, a kind of this thing called T, to help attract the renters." Now, that building was a tremendous success, of course, and this is a little bit of a design of what the whole World Trade Center looks like, at least it's sort of a map of where the different buildings are, you know, the Tower number 1 and Tower number 2, etc. In 1993, as a lot of you know, there was a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. After that bombing, inspectors found fireproofing to be deficient. And by 9/11, replacement was completed on 18 floors on the first tower and 13 floors on the second tower. There were long trusses that were developed, very long trusses, very long beams kind of going across to maximize that open space. And then they were sitting on the little angle that you see there and fastened by 5/8 inch bolts. So I'd like to just jump right in now to the collapse scenario. First of all, the planes hit at 450 to 550 miles an hour, depending on who you talk to. The planes were steeply banked, causing maximum damage. 282,000-pound planes were crashing in, and 60% of the columns on the crash side were destroyed. There were other causes. The fire insulation was stripped off right away. The water sprinklers were also were cut off, so there was no possibility of that. The collapse of safety factor of 3 was reduced drastically. There was an eccentric load on the surviving beams. The structural damage went really throughout the building because people were unable to open up their doors 20 and 30 stories below, according to NIST. So 30 seconds after impact, you can see that design right there. And then the fires begin, and that's where the real damage gets going. And I'd like to, jump ahead a little bit there. The explosions, once that plane came in, the explosions began to radiate in every direction. There were 90,000 plus liters of jet fuel that were exploded out there. Fires radiated to all 4 sides within 15 minutes. And hold on one second here. I'm going to get this video going. I'm having a little trouble with the video. There we go. This is a Purdue University study picture of what it looked like when the plane, it's their simulation of what happened inside. And there was a tremendous amount of structural damage, as you can see first, and then it went off from there to, as the plane came in, as the jet came in, you'll see a lot more damage happening with the fire in just a minute as well. I'd like to say that steel, we know that steel melts at about 2,750 degrees, and so the steel damage bringing it up to 2,750 is very, very unlikely to have happened. However, on the other hand, steel loses about half of its strength at about 11 or 1200 degrees, and fires from from the fuel starts at about 800 to 1500 degrees. We see a small part of the explosion outside. The jet fuel explosions went down to the 77th floor, the 22nd floor down the elevator shaft, into the lobby from the elevator shaft. There was a fatal fireball in the lobby due to elevator fires. There was bad inward bowing of the perimeter columns and a huge differential of temperature along the individual beams and trusses. This is just a little bit of information about steel and different temperatures and what happens to it. The thermal limit of structural steel is only 750 degrees. Beyond that, you can start bending it for making steel trusses for bridges and that sort of thing. The bright orange flames that you see here would kind of tend to give us a little bit of an idea that maybe the NIST report is right, that 1800 degree fires were happening, because that's the color of an 1800 degree fire. These major fires were on multiple floors, not just the first 4 floors or so initially, but then going up more and more. And as you can see, there's even satellite images that show that the smoke was enormous, that the fire spread at record speeds. There was an inward buckling of the perimeter columns, and what happens here is that there was a sagging that took place. And that you can see, there's some photographic evidence of it that NIST has provided that shows that in the beginning the things were pretty straight across there, but then one of the floors started to sag, and it sagged quite a bit, and that started pulling it in. Let's see if this video wants to work for me. So what you see here is as the fire comes along, then you see this sagging, and it starts pulling up against the building, and it starts pulling it inside, which is why we see that, and we can actually see that in the next picture that's going to happen. That snaps, and then the collapse begins. We have 180 million pounds of building on the top, pretty soon crashing at about 100 miles an hour plus. You can see the major bowing. This could not have been caused by nanothermites. This is 1 minute before the collapse where you see that picture. And so the building that had twice the weight above the crash site collapsed twice as quickly. The NYPD Aviation said the top of the tower might be leaning just a few minutes before. A minute later, they said buckling on the southwest corner is leaning the building toward the south. And then at 10:28 a.m., the roof is going to come down very soon. And then the north tower collapsed just a few seconds after that. The 13-story high facade that was left behind that we all know so well, nanothermites did not pulverize this. If it stayed up there, it kept its integrity, and that would not have happened.
We're going to go to Richard Gage, Mr. Richard Gage, for a 2-minute response to this introduction.
I didn't see the 13-story portion of the building at the bottom of the Twin Towers. I see a 2-story pile. We'll come back to that. Thomas Eigers suggests that we're using the reverse scientific method, where we pick our evidence to support our position, cherry-picking it. We'll see today that all of the evidence of at the World Trade Center high-rises supports the hypothesis of explosive controlled demolition, and none of it supports the hypothesis of destruction by fire. The building is 90% air, but every building is 90% air. But they don't come down at near free-fall speeds. They never have, in fact, prior to 9/11, and yet we have 3 examples of that on 9/11. The air is irrelevant. The fireproofing, some of it may have been scraped off, but the rest of it wasn't. The plane didn't take all the fireproofing off uniformly all around the core structure of the building. So it's irrelevant, as we'll see, how much of the fireproofing came off. My opponent suggests that the steel didn't melt. There's plenty of evidence to suggest, including from official sources, that the steel did melt, and we'll see that evidence today. The color of an 1800-degree fire is not evidenced with thick, dark, black smoke, which suggests that the fire was indeed oxygen-starved and on its way out, particularly in the South Tower, where the flames were dying down when Chief Oriel Palmer suggested that we have that we have isolated pockets of fire, 2 of them, that could easily be put out by two lines that they could bring up.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. And now let's allow Richard Gage to make his initial 10-minute opening statement.
Good evening. After careful examination of the official explanation of the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers, along with eyewitness testimony and forensic data that was omitted from the official reports, the 1,450 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, along with professionals and citizens in the 9/11 Truth movement, have concluded that a new independent investigation into these catastrophic events is both necessary and essential to the very preservation of our democracy. The information assembled by us does not come out of the blue. Millions across our country have joined the 9/11 Truth movement to expose this evidence to the American people and to seek justice. Why? Well, let's start with the 9/11 Commission. Composed mostly of lawyers and politicians, no engineers, who said, among other things, we were set up to fail. It's not to be considered the last word on the attacks, but only a beginning, the report that they issued. And it didn't even include World Trade Center 7's destruction, the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history. Tim Romer on the commission says, we were extremely frustrated with the false statements we were getting. Max Cleland, this investigation is now compromised, he stated before he resigned in disgust. It's a national scandal. America is being cheated. The White House wants to cover it up. And John Farmer, senior counsel for the 9/11 Commission, states, I was shocked at how different the truth was from the way it was described. The tapes told a radically different story from what has been told to us and the public. He says there was an agreement not to tell the truth. Speaking of not telling the truth, let's move on to NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, the government agency that is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce under the Bush administration. Though NIST was tasked with analyzing and explaining the 3 worst and most unexpected catastrophic failures in modern history, the Bush administration allocated far less resources for the task than was used to investigate Bill Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky. In their 10,000-page report, NIST could easily have, but explicitly avoided, analyzing the behavior of the Twin Towers after the point at which the collapses began. The focus of the 3-year, $20 million study was on how each tower became poised for collapse by the damage caused by the jetliner impacts and the resulting fires, on the a priori assumption that those were the causes of those collapse. No other hypothesis for what brought down the skyscrapers was discussed in the report, even though all of the evidence you're about to see tonight was available to them. This is not science. This is a cover-up. Tonight you're likely to hear many of the typical fancy explanations, rationalizations, hand-waving, appeals to authority, and false syllogisms and other logical fallacies that are commonly heard from the defenders of the official accounts of these events. But there are numerous physical impossibilities in these reports in themselves. If any one of them remains unresolved after tonight, the debate is over. And my opponent should be compelled to join us and millions of others across the country in demanding a new investigation. Here are just a few of those physical impossibilities. My opponent must resolve the symmetrical, free-fall collapse of the World Trade Center Building 7 without the use of explosives, or the debate is over. The melting of steel girders, documented by structural engineers and FEMA, or the debate is over. The documented finding of several tons of molten steel or iron in the debris pile of all 3 buildings without the use of incendiaries, or the debate is over. The billions of previously molten iron microspheres discovered by the USGS in the World Trade Center dust without the use of incendiaries, or the debate is over. The red-gray chips of advanced energetic nanothermite composite materials found in the World Trade Center dust, or the debate is over. What my opponent thinks, understands, believes, what might have happened is of no consequence unless it is proven. Listen tonight for the easy explanations for the tower's natural collapse from the defenders of the official account. In fact, If these explanations for the Twin Towers' demise was so easy, then why did NIST not even provide an analysis of that collapse? They simply speculate about the collapse in a mere 1/2 page statement. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that. It came down in essentially free fall speed. 1/2 page. And why have we received written support from the FBI upon a written request to investigate these 3 collapses? The FBI's Assistant Director for Counterterrorism, Michael Heimbach, writes, Mr. Gage presents an interesting theory backed by thorough research and analysis. Could it be because we, unlike NIST, apply the time-honored scientific method, which many of us learned in the 7th or 8th grade, being the best way yet for winnowing error from truth? It starts with honest background research, like the structure of the World Trade Center towers, which, far from being weak and cheap, was robustly designed 5 times its required capacity to hold up the loads. Per NIST, it was a very redundant, robust structure. It performed its job when the plane impacts hit. They merely speculate that it succumbed to the fires. NIST, it's composed of 47 massive core columns arranged around the elevator shafts and surrounded by 14-inch box columns at 3 feet 9 inches on center. Extremely robust structure. There's more steel on the exterior than there is window space. Let's take a look. NIST claims that the upper block of each of the Twin Towers crushed the lower block, but video analysis reveals clearly that the upper block was fragmented in waves of explosions prior to the crushing of the lower block. Furthermore, the lighter, less strong upper block could not have destroyed the heavier, much stronger lower block, even if the upper block had remained in one piece. NIST didn't even conduct simple calculations or experiments to substantiate their column failure theory of crush down, crush up, which ignores the uniform downward near free-fall acceleration observed in the videos. Why did NIST have to falsify, for instance, the computer model with an artificial 5,000-pound lateral load on each perimeter column in order to justify the observed inward bowing phenomena which is alleged to have started the structural failure? The inward bowing at the onset of destruction couldn't have been caused by the minimal additional horizontal loads allegedly applied from these sagging floor trusses. Were they instead caused by the explosive sabotage of the core columns, acknowledged by NIST to have failed slightly ahead of the perimeter columns? Did the core columns then pull in the trusses, and which in turn pulled in the perimeter columns with the much greater available forces? We believe that there's ample evidence to back up the hypothesis of the explosive controlled demolition of the Twin Towers. My opponent and I have radically different perspectives on the same body of evidence. We request your patient attention, critical thinking, and follow-up research of your own in order to find your own personal conclusions.
Richard, you have another 1 minute and 29 seconds if you wish to take it.
I yield my time.
Okay. Unlike Congress, however, you're not going to get it back later. Oh. Now then, if we could reset the timer to the 2 minutes. We're going to allow Mr. Chris Mohr to now rebut Richard's opening remarks for 2 minutes.
And thank you. I do have a little slide for this as well. First of all, Richard is a master of rhetoric, but I promise you that this debate, I'm going to slug it out all the way to the end. The debate is not over if you're not satisfied with all my answers. It's true that NIST didn't talk about the collapse itself, and I promise you we will talk about why. They gave me some interesting answers on the telephone of that. Richard, in his Blueprint for Truth video, always talks about the many ways that this is so much like controlled demolition, that these collapses that we see. In 100 other ways, I think it's completely different. By definition, a controlled demolition, you have control of all the variables, and everybody who's in the controlled demolition field says the same thing. We have variables like plane crashes, 30,000 plus workers watching the holes being drilled into their office walls. Paranoid people who were part of that 1993 terrorist attack and were victims of that in one way or another. Hearing tapping sounds, strong smells of welding torches for controlled demolition preparation. Major fires with huge collapses, local collapses all over the place. I did not find one worker who reported that kind of suspicious preparation activity, and not one controlled demolition firm has said it would be possible to carry out a controlled demolition with these incredible variables that are happening. Even former controlled demolition employee Tom Sullivan, a rare person in the business who does believe this was a controlled demolition, told me, quote, "Not getting this critical timing right results in a hung structure, meaning floors and entire sections not to collapse but rather pile up. It is very hard indeed to get these buildings down in a controlled manner under the best of circumstances when everything is studied and indeed controlled."
One of the ways you could repeat the destruction of the towers every time is to take down the core columns, the outer core columns, the ones on the inside, and cut the corners of the perimeter. And then the perimeters are just going to pedal out. Well, if you look at the debris map, that's exactly what happened. If you cut the corners, you just have a flat sheet. It loses its orthogonal support.
Well, I'd like to compare for you. Oh my gosh, I'm out of time. This is the rumbling collapse of what we heard on the collapse of the towers. Do we have the sound?
All right, Mr. Mohr, time's up.
I'll give you the comparison later.
Okay. We're going to proceed now to a series of questions to each of our debaters. You should know that the order in which we're going to ask the questions has been agreed to in advance by the two of them. We'll first start off with a question addressed to Mr. Chris Mohr, and it deals with the history of fires in high-rise buildings. Mr. Mohr, there has never been a steel frame high-rise collapse from fire in history, yet we are told it happened 3 times on September 11th. Isn't this really evidence of controlled demolition?
It's an excellent question, and actually it's one of the few things that NIST and I and Richard Gage agree on. NIST itself says there is no history of destruction by fire in steel frame high-rises. And I apologize, but I just have to play this one video here. Oh, please come back. Let's see. This is a video. You can hear the sounds of the controlled demolition. This is a real controlled demolition. Squids going up and down. Lots of noise. Squids in a nice orderly pattern. Collapse on the bottom and then moving its way up. And so that's something that I wanted to be sure you saw. There have been steel frame structures that have collapsed in controlled demolition. Oh, come back. Okay. So there are many different places where we have seen the collapse of steel structures. The Sound Theater in Pennsylvania, the McCormick Center in Chicago, the Cadell Toy Factory in Singapore, the Mumbai High North Oil Platform, the Interstate 580 overpass near San Francisco. World Trade Center 5 even had a partial collapse of 4 floors as well. And we can see that a little bit here. I don't know if nanothermites were just used on those 4 floors or if they were, or, what was going on. Maybe they had a little bit left over there. People have been surprised by the collapse of steel frame buildings since 1900. Back in the days of the unsinkable ship Titanic, they thought that they had indestructible buildings that were falling down back in those days. Traditional buildings are usually steel reinforced concrete, but one of the very rare buildings that's a very tall building that doesn't have that steel reinforcement is the World Trade Center towers. Vincent Dunn has seen twisted, warped, bent, and sagging steel in fires. Steel tries to expand at both ends, and when it can no longer expand, it sags. Robert Baring says that steel frame buildings can collapse as a result of fire. This is true for all types of construction materials, not only steel. And if steel can't be brought down with fire, then I wonder why anybody would ever bother to even put fireproofing into a building. And Richard, I give you that question.
Now Richard Gage gets 2 minutes to respond.
We do indeed put fireproofing into steel buildings because it makes them indestructible in fires. No steel frame high-rise has ever come down due to fires, as you'll see in this slide. We have in New York a 50-story building It's burned for 6 hours. In Los Angeles, a 62-story building burned over 3.5 hours over 5 floors. In Philadelphia, a 38-story building burned 18 hours over 8 floors. And in Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over a total of 26 floors. Did they come down? No. Why? Steel frame buildings steel structure is an incredible heat sink. It absorbs that heat and conducts it away from the source. So even in the case where there's no fireproofing, like in the Cardington tests, which had 2,000-degree fires, they did not fail. Why? Because the steel does indeed conduct this heat throughout the building. Now, my opponent showed you a classic controlled demolition with high-energy explosives like C4 and RDX, which have a loud bang, and they have bright flashes. If you were going to do a deceptive controlled demolition, which is what we're seeing in the Twin Towers in Building 7, you would instead use something that wouldn't tip your hand, something quieter, something like an incendiary, which ignites and fizzles. In the case of Building 7, doesn't provide those bright flashes, but yields a lot more evidence, which we're going to be showing you in just a few minutes. Relative to holes being drilled in preparation, this could be done over a period of months in the World Trade Center high-rises, in which we'll show you how much access they had to, uninterrupted access, unseen by the occupants of the building.
All right, and now we invite our two debaters to talk with each other for 1 minute.
Well, you talked about how conductive steel is and how it conducts heat away. Well, copper is 8 times as conductive as steel, for one thing. And I wanted to ask you about, I think you're theorizing about nanothermites. It's sometimes difficult to know exactly what the theory is because there's so many different ones out there. My understanding of nanothermites is that it's very explosive. Richard, what do you say to that?
Nanothermite is a very advanced energetic material which can be designed in very sophisticated laboratories, operated only by the most sophisticated U.S. defense contractors, by the way. It can be designed to be as an incendiary and it goes fizzle, or it can be designed very explosively. We don't know exactly how they were designed, but we do have the evidence that we'll be looking at of them. Why are they found in the World Trade Center dust at all?
And then my last question again, as an architect, why would you even want to bother putting fireproofing onto steel if it can't collapse in fire?
Well, because steel collapses when it is not fireproof. The ones you cited collapsed only because they were not fireproof. These are low rises.
Time's up, Mr. Gage. All right, we're ready now for our second question, and I remind you that the order for these questions was agreed to by our two debaters in advance, and it again goes to Mr. Chris Mohr, and it involves the near freefall destruction of the towers. Mr. Mohr, the towers are seen to be coming down very fast, as if in free fall. How can this happen without controlled demolition?
Well, thank you. First of all, the towers, I think almost free fall speed is not really accurate. And this says the first exterior panels hit the ground in 9 to 11 seconds. That represents free fall speed. Thomas Eiger says that most of the building fell at 2/3 of free fall speed and took about 15 seconds to fall. And then the core with its extra structural supports came down last. And there is some recent photographs with some evidence of that. If you look down about 2/3 of the way down there, you can see evidence that the core itself is right there. It is the last thing to be collapsing. 12 or 28 stories of, depending on which one of them, the core comes down later, so as much as 25 seconds after everything else, and that's because it had more resistance to the downward momentum. If I told you guys I was making almost $100,000 a year, and then you found out that I was making $67,000 a year, you'd think I was exaggerating. Almost free fall speed, or near free fall speed, when we're talking about the towers, is simply not an accurate description of what actually happened. If there were any kind of controlled demolition, then we would find, that things would come down a lot faster. Now, F equals ma is the formula that I think that's very relevant here. And I did a little experiment to show you the power of gravitational acceleration. And basically what I did was I took a scale that is capable of measuring 300 pounds of weight. I put a 25-pound weight onto that scale, and then I picked it up and I dropped it to see what would happen. What would it measure after only 6.5 feet, or half of a story? Well, I destroyed the scale. And so that kind of tells you a little bit of something, that F equals ma. Within 1 second, we have 10 times as much force. That 25 pounds, within just over a second, had so much force that it actually destroyed the measuring device itself. So we have to be kind of aware of the power of gravity here, and it's a big one. The World Trade Center buildings, 1 billion pounds, 100 miles an hour, 180 million pounds crashing down onto it.
It's interesting that the scale slowed down the acceleration of the weight. The scale did not pulverize to dust or metal fragments. We'll see in the case of the Twin Towers that it did. Controlled demolitions have very specific characteristics. Let's look at a couple. These 10 characteristics, including the sudden onset of destruction, are all proof of controlled demolition. Sudden onset of destruction at the base of the tower. Straight down, symmetrical collapse into its own footprint. Demolition waves remove the column supports. That's how we get the symmetry. A free fall speed, often, through the path of what was the greatest resistance, resulting in the total dismemberment of the steel structure, broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Minimal damage caused to adjacent structures. Sounds and flashes of explosions, or nearly as loud as explosions in the case of thermite sometimes, which are heard and seen by witnesses. Enormous clouds of pulverized concrete filling the air, squibs or isolated ejections of explosives going off, chemical evidence of cutter charges. We'll see all this in the evidence tonight. It's all direct evidence of explosive destruction, and guess what? Fire can't create any one of these phenomena, let alone all of them. Additional supporting documentation, like experts agree, yeah, it's a controlled demolition. Government documentation often helps us. This is all proof of a controlled demolition, which we're going to see in the case of Building 7 and the North Tower tonight. Regarding the near free fall, the lightest structure is composed at the top. Let's take a look. We're talking about equal and opposite forces here. The bottom structure is not unlike a Mack truck running into the top portion, which is much lighter, less strong. We have an equal and opposite reaction, even if they're not running headlong into each other. Which one's going to be destroyed first? The Mack truck or the Volkswagen? The lower portion or the upper portion?
All right, gentlemen, now you have 1 minute to discuss among yourselves.
So you're actually saying that a 180 million pound building top coming down at over 100 miles an hour is not capable of causing a collapse. That makes no sense to me. I mean, I took a 25-pound weight and messed up my scale with 6.5 feet. I don't understand how you're denying the power of gravity to destroy that building.
Let's take a look. We have, what do we see? Do we see a 180 million pound building coming down at free fall acceleration? No. What we're seeing is the top portion of the building being destroyed itself in 4 seconds. After that, there's nothing crushing the rest of the building. It's coming down at that near free fall acceleration. It's going faster and faster and faster, straight down through the path of greatest resistance. Not being slowed down at all. It's going faster and faster. This is acceleration.
It is slowed down to 2/3 of free fall acceleration. Stop exaggerating, number one. And number two, this collapse here, well, I've run out of time, so I'll make that point later.
Well, we have an agreement that even if time runs out, our participants are allowed to finish their sentence. So you are allowed to finish your sentence.
I think I'll drop it for now.
Very good.
Go ahead.
Like Congress, you can't get it back later.
That's right.
Okay. We're going to go again now to Chris Mohr. And we're going to continue. South Tower destruction. The top of the South Tower actually tilted first when it started to come down. Mr. Mohr, though the damage to each tower was asymmetrical, the towers come straight down rather than topple over. Isn't this evidence of controlled demolition?
Thank you. And first of all, gravity, it brings things straight down. It's very interesting. I know Richard used this, and this was actually very impressive. The way Richard used this in his Blueprint for Truth video. this he sees where the tilting tower starts tipping 22 degrees on the south tower. And then he says, angular momentum should keep that kind of going. Well, all three of the buildings, in every case, all three of the buildings began their collapses into their weakest points. This is the most dramatic one that has a 22-degree thing where the collapse begins just above the crash point. And Tom Sullivan, again, the controlled demolition guy, says you couldn't have a controlled demolition in a fire zone. So he says that the plane crashes would have to be precisely planned and the demolition starting away from the fires. But these collapses started right inside of the fires. If these explosives were placed, they would have been destroyed and damaged. Explosives burn, detonate, or chemically degrade in high heat. They're very sensitive components. Controlled demolitions could not instantly right a 180 million pound block. That would not be possible. So sometimes you say, well, why didn't it just tip over more? You need some kind of lateral force to do that. You can't just have something tip over unless there's enough force. If there's angular momentum, if there's enough angular momentum, it will tip over all the way. If there's not enough angular momentum, and it did get to 22 degrees, gravity, in this case, trumped it. There wasn't enough angular momentum, and it came back down again. So that explains very simply, and as soon as it started coming down, gravity took care of the rest. Gravity, gravity, gravity. I keep telling you that. The fast descent of the building, many of the engineers and experts that I talked to said that the building would collapse to the ground before it even had time to tip over, even if it did have enough angular momentum. And the crushed structure does resist, and the reactive force tends to keep the upper block straightened back out again. So those are just a few of the things that I wanted to say about that, but I talked to so many people, and almost every single expert that I talked to agrees that this would have ended up coming straight down, that gravity trumps it all.
Richard?
Well, I wish that were true. We have 22 degrees off center of this massive structure. But what happens? We have the we would expect it to fall in some mangled heap at the bottom. But what does it do? It disintegrates. It defragments into its individual structural components, which, as we'll see, are then hurled in all directions symmetrically outside the footprint. The structure is completely dismembered. And we have at the base, underneath this incredible destruction, like the firemen described, 118 of them who were interviewed in the oral histories, bands of explosions, pop, 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 all the way around the building, traversing in nearly free fall acceleration. Again, faster and faster, not slowing down. There is no deceleration occurring in either twin tower. While they're not at free fall, they are darn near it, but it doesn't slow down. It gets faster and faster. We would expect asymmetry at the base of these towers, given that there was asymmetrical damage from the airplanes, asymmetrical damage from the fires, and asymmetrical loading from this massive heap, this massive top portion that is off-center from below. But what do we see at the base? Complete symmetry of equally distributed, individually cut structural columns. It's and outside the footprint of the building. This is supposed to be a gravitational pancaking collapse. What do we see at the base? Anything but a pile, and we'll be looking for those floors in that pile in a moment.
All right, gentlemen, 1 minute to go back and forth.
Well, you talked before, Richard, about how the top disintegrated in 4 seconds, and that seems to be true. We have two essentially monster pile drivers pushing against each other. Within 4 seconds, the top has lost its structural integrity. But I don't think that means very much in terms of the mass. The mass is still there. It's still coming down at 100 miles an hour, and I would not want a ton of bricks falling on my head, even if they were broken up, coming onto my head at 100 miles an hour. I'm sorry, it doesn't make sense that just because they're broken up, they have no mass anymore. That seems to be what you're implying.
Well, no, actually, what would feel better on your head? A box of apples falling on it, or individual apples from that box? What we have is the individual structural elements that are broken up. How can they crush the building at any rate when they're totally defragmented?
Well, again, I still say that you're not taking gravity into account. The fragmentation of it doesn't change the mass, and the mass is coming down at 100 miles an hour. And I'm sorry, but I don't think anything can stand up to that.
The problem is,
all right,
is that
out of time, and we're going to go next to a question for Richard Gage. First, however, I'd like to remind the audience that we are taping for television. We ask that you withhold your comments until later on, when we'd like to give our opinion together to both participants equally. All right, then. Mr. Gage, the lateral ejection of heavy objects. We have a question for you. Heavy steel beams were ejected from the building, and some traveled pretty far. Can't this happen from a natural collapse as the beams are being snapped off?
Well, indeed, we have quite incredible ejection from these buildings. In fact, they're landing, these 9-ton and 4-ton perimeter wall units are landing up to 600 feet away. They are ripped into the outside facades of the surrounding buildings. They are clocked by physicists with their horizontal vector traveling 70 to 80 miles an hour, instant speed, laterally. Now, this can't be caused by air pressure, because the air pressure is not enough. It's about 14 to 20 pounds per square inch, as we'll see here. The air pressure cannot be developed sufficiently. All of that minimal air pressure, less than what's in your bicycle tires at home, would be going out through the windows, not blowing these heavy structural units laterally. It just can't happen. It takes incredible energy, like the energy required of a 200-pound cannonball blowing 3 miles away. And there's lots of these perimeter wall units in all directions, symmetrically landing up to 600 feet away. It's absolutely uncanny.
Richard, you continue being generous with your time. We're now going to go to Mr. Mohr for 2 minutes of rebuttal.
Okay, thank you. We have. I'm going to actually borrow the slide that Richard used just now about the lateral ejection, if we can switch over to that. And it's not as good as his, and I apologize for that. But this is a model of lateral ejection caused by natural collapse. As the building collapses, as the speed increases on the collapse, air is pushing out faster and faster, causing greater lateral ejection, which is exactly what you see in that there. There is very, very little lateral ejection at first when this goes. Now, if it were all being done by a controlled demolition of some kind, then you would see that the lateral ejection would be pretty much the same all the way down. But look carefully, and you'll see that that is absolutely not the case. It starts out very, very little, just a little bit of lateral ejection, and then as it goes down, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That's because of acceleration. What we see happening here is an enormous amount of air. 1/2 million cubic feet of air per floor being pushed down at something like 12 or 13 floors per second. That's 100,000 pounds per square inch, 482 mile an hour winds. Yes, that is very, very possible to take large things and move them around. I apologize. Here we go. Here's an example of something from Hurricane Andrew, and you may have seen pictures like this. Okay, 1/4 the speed of the air that was coming out of the towers during their collapse, and here you see that Hurricane Andrew impaled plywood with winds of only 124 miles an hour or so. The plywood goes right through, and I think that it's very, very possible that speeds that are more than twice that of a tornado can cause the kind of damage that we see with that lateral ejection. It would seem to me to be absolutely inevitable. And I might add that anything, if it's a controlled demolition, I might add, Richard, that makes it impossible for it not to be a very explosive controlled demolition that is very, very loud. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to shoot all that stuff out. My air pressure thing is a much better explanation for it.
All right, gentlemen, you have 1 minute to go back and forth on this.
And, of course, I disagree with you on this point, Chris.
Really?
These isolated ejections are occurring 20, 40, even 60 stories down below. If these were evidence of air pressures, incredible air pressure, we wouldn't see them in highly engineered, pinpoint accurate ejections that occur at the midpoints of the facades. We would see all those windows blowing out at once, if any of them.
Well, wait a
But
minute. Now,
since
just a second though. If your tire blows out, it doesn't blow out all over the tire. It blows out in its weakest spot, right?
Okay, that's fair, but we don't have enough air pressure to blow out even the windows in this case. It's very well documented here, about 15 pounds per square inch, because one floor is falling at a time, and there's trusses under each floor. So that creates an air cushion for the air pressure to get out. That's
not a
calculated.
500,000 cubic feet per floor times 100 miles an hour coming down. I'm sorry.
15
Gentlemen,
Yes,
time up on this back and forth. All right, then. We're going to go now to another question for Chris Mohr. It involves these squibs and isolated ejections that they're talking about, air pressure explosions. Mr. Mohr, puffs of smoke, which look like explosions, appear sometimes up to 20 to 30 stories below the destruction as the towers came down. How could this be possible in a natural collapse?
That's a good question, actually. And I want to first of all talk about the randomness of these squibs. I know that Richard is going to try and tell you that they have a pattern, but if you combine it with the new David Chandler video of squibs that are not only kind of in the middle section that Richard talks about, but now he's finding squibs right by the edge as well, then we see that the squibs taken as a whole have a very, very random pattern. There's no orderliness to it. Any kind of controlled demolition would have some kind of orderly pattern that would be easy to find, not by just trying to create some artificial pattern later on. If the squibs were controlled demolition, then they would go off before the collapse begins, but the squibs happen only after the collapse began. Survivors talked about a hurricane wind that they felt in the stairwells. And if the squibs were explosive demolition charges, they would have created structural deformations, and that absolutely did not happen as well. The squibs also are opposite the kind of pattern that you see in an explosion. Watch this carefully, down about 2/3 of the way down. It starts slowly in the squib. See, there it goes, and then it gets bigger. An explosion starts big, and then it gets smaller. So that's just just one more example. And also, if these squibs were premature charges that were going off, which I know that Richard and many others have suggested, then there would also be other charges, perhaps. This is obviously an imperfect controlled demolition now, right? And if that's happening, then we have others that aren't going to go off at all. Not one person has ever found physical evidence of controlled demolition in the rubble when they were going through it. They never found an unexploded cap or a radio receiver or anything like that. A 110-story building, by the way, of 95% air would leave a debris pile of only about 6 or 7 stories if all the air were removed, and I think it was about 13 stories, just for what it's worth. But the squibs themselves are, for me, evidence that the shock waves that are traveling up and down at almost the speed of sound from the collapse up higher are creating horrible structural problems as the collapse is beginning. And as a result of that, the squibs kind of come out in relatively random patterns as a result.
The initial ejection is totally horizontal. It comes out at high speed at a horizontal rate of up to 200 feet per second. Now, the only reason it has a vertical component is because gravity takes hold of the material in that squib and slowly accelerates that. So at first the vertical velocity is very small because the gravitational acceleration has not yet taken hold of it. So it mostly comes out vertically. Eventually, as it travels in the horizontal direction, and how far it travels depends upon the resistance of the air to the material that's there. And some of the material travels a long way. Well, then the gravitational acceleration slowly builds up a greater vertical velocity and eventually hits the ground at a very high rate of speed, almost as high as it started out with, and does major damage to whatever it hits on the ground. In the photograph of the squib, we estimated the initial velocity. The squib comes out almost horizontally, but from the distance it has traveled out versus the width of the North Tower, which is about 205 feet, as I recall. And that squib is approximately equal to one-third of that distance. And it has developed in about 1/2 of a second. So we would estimate that the squib material at the advance is traveling out more than 140 feet per second. And I think I used 160 feet per second in the calculation itself, which calculated how far the material went before it did major damage on the ground.
Well, here's what we do see at the bottom of the pile. A 2-story pile. How many floors of the 110 floors are found? Each an acre in size. None. The photographs show generally no floors. 4-inch thick concrete over metal decking. They were completely pulverized. What we see is core columns and perimeter columns. We're looking for pancakes in a pancaking collapse, especially a 110-story building, which should be 30 stories at least of flooring, including 10,000 floor trusses that are missing. Regarding these squibs, these are pulverized building materials that are occurring. They're clocked at 160 to 200 feet per second. These are explosive speeds. And if this was a natural collapse with this large section pushing down the rest of the building, which we already saw was destroyed in the first few seconds, we wouldn't see this remaining tower rising up. In fact, that remaining tower is evidence that the air pressures, the massive air pressures, which my opponent is discussing here, would have a great channel way up through that defragmented mass so that it would relieve itself upwardly, not push down through, again, the path of greatest resistance, but it wouldn't be developed at all, not even to the bicycle pressure speeds of 30 to 50 psi. We have these focalized ejections that occur in open office space. How do we get pinpoint ejections halfway across the midpoints of the facade when most all the floors look like this, open office space? All those windows, again, would blow out, if any of them. But no, we see these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, geometrically precise, violent ejections occurring in this engineered pattern.
Gentlemen, 1 minute.
Well, first I want to be sure, because I think Richard might be confusing the squibs with the lateral ejection. I could be wrong. Maybe you can correct me on this, Richard. I don't believe that there were any massive lateral ejection of huge bits of, hunks of steel 30 stories below the collapse. I think squibs were happening, little jets. Am I correct on that?
Agreed.
Okay. So I just wanted to be sure we're clear about that. Also, you were talking about how it's only 2 stories. That's above, and then if you go digging down, we find at least 4 more stories of rubble underneath the towers because it came crashing down underneath.
Actually, what we see in the slide that we're about to see is the remaining shards. This is proof that the basements did not collapse down. There are no stacks of floors from the ground floor up, down, stacked up in the basement. The perimeter shards do, in fact, show that cave-in did not happen.
Well, gravity does terrible things, and that's why we couldn't find the floors. I'm convinced of that.
All right. We're going to now ask Mr. Gage another question. It's concerning something you briefly mentioned, pulverized concrete and metal decking. Mr. Gage, you claim that the preponderance of dust from the collapses indicates controlled demolition. Shouldn't one expect this from the crushing of a natural collapse?
Well, let's see what we would expect from a natural collapse. Well, from explosions first. Like this eruption, volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea. Upward, outward, arching streamers. Violent symmetry, evocative of the geometry of fireworks. Thick pyroclastic clouds with intense heat causing the cauliflower-like formations from that intense heat and known explosions. Is there any similarity in the development of the destruction of the Twin Towers, the North Tower, which you see on the left? Again, upward, outward arching streamers, thick pyroclastic clouds, intense heat causing that. Does it look to you like a gravitational collapse? Is there enough similarity in these two different systems to warrant a new investigation into the possibility of explosive controlled demolition, particularly since it looks like one and since no fire has ever brought down a steel frame skyscraper? Again, where is all the concrete? We don't see it at the base. It's spread throughout lower Manhattan in a 4 to 12-inch thick blanket. 30% of this dust, by tests, is composed of finely ground concrete, 100-micron particles, like talcum powder. Where's the metal decking? 220 acres of thick metal decking. I found it in the World Trade Center dust. It comes up to a magnet. Galvanized iron particles like metal filings. 10,000 file cabinets missing. And the victims, 2,749 of them, but 1,000 of them are still missing. Pieces small enough to fit into a test tube, 6,000. And
Richard,
yet 786 bone fragments are found on top of a building 500 feet away, 250 feet away, high-rise that is 500 feet tall. How did they get there? How were they so small?
Time is up. All right. Let's see. Now we're going to go to Chris Mohr for a response.
Well, Richard, every physicist and every engineer I've ever talked to, with the exception of Gordon Ross, insists that there was plenty of energy to gradually pulverize 3 to 4 inch layers of concrete on every floor. We ask ourselves how all this dust, and I have this huge dust cloud that I have up here as a little bit of a demonstration, which is a mixture of concrete and gypsum and that sort of thing. How could all of that have happened from a simple natural collapse? I come back to gravity again. First of all, you don't have to pulverize the concrete on every floor as you go. You can have it keep getting smashed and smashed and smashed and smashed until it's fully pulverized, and then it comes out. I'd like to mention also that rescue workers walked on cool rubble right after the end of the collapse. They were out there before Building 7 even collapsed. I don't know how 4,500 degree nanothermites could possibly be consistent with that fact. Pyroclastic clouds that you talk about in your comparison with volcanoes, it kills entire villages. And the one in Indonesia, I think it was in 2009, is a really good example of that. Thousands of pyroclastic cloud survivors needed ventilators. It was a terrible thing for those people because they were breathing 1,100 to 1,400 degree air. Many of them died. Yes, this does look like the kind of thing. This is a real pyroclastic cloud. In the daytime, it looks like what happened at the World Trade Center, but it is not. If you look at it at night, you can see it is red hot. It is glowing. Where are the people who are covered in fresh dust and debris from 9/11 who had to go onto ventilators by the thousands? That didn't happen. I've hypothesized that the 9/11 dust might be warm, perhaps a little bit warmer because of the fact that it was mixed in with some of the floors with fire. And there is someone who actually just told me as an eyewitness recently that was the case, that it was warm dust and not just cool dust. The other thing that I also wonder about, Richard, is just the question of, here you have all these people, for one thing, that are just kind of running through, but we don't have reports of that kind of a problem, and we have paper all over the place. How is that consistent with millions of pieces of paper flying all over the place after this collapse? It's not consistent with 4,500 degree nanothermites.
Well, it's clear that the explosives sent paper flying everywhere, and nanothermite can be engineered as an explosive, but things happen in stages, explosions and then paper flying everywhere. Relative to the energy required to pulverize concrete, there is a massive amount of gravitational potential energy in the building, about 100,000 kilowatt hours, but there is no mechanism to pulverize the concrete. You can have all the potential gravitational in the Niagara Falls, but you don't get electricity unless you have a generator.
I don't need electricity. All I need is gravity. 180 million pounds coming down at 100 miles an hour. That pulverizes 3 inches of concrete real fast.
But it doesn't pulverize metal decking into fine metal filings.
I would say it does. I would say there's more than enough gravitational power to do all of those things. No doubt in my mind about that.
We'll have to agree to disagree on this.
Okay.
Maybe we can agree for another debate sometime in the future to get to some other questions. But in the meanwhile, we still have some here. Let's go again to Richard Gage with this one. Eyewitnesses of explosions in the Twin Towers. Mr. Gage, you claim that people heard explosions during the collapses, and this indicates controlled demolition. Wouldn't this be happening as the building came down during a natural collapse as well, random explosions?
Well, indeed, we'd expect some explosions in a fire or in a gravitational collapse, but we've already ruled out gravitational collapse. What we're now looking at is the witnesses, 118 of them, that reported orally to the Chief Fire Commissioner, Thomas von Essen, that they heard sounds of explosions. They saw flashes of light. 118 of them hearing one, the other, or both, such as this firefighter. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there's this orange and red flash coming out. It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings. It seemed like it was going all the way around, like a belt, all these explosions. You can see this in controlled demolition on the left, falling rapidly at near free-fall acceleration. Is there any similarity? Enough to warrant a new investigation into the possible use of explosives? Maybe so. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted between floors 10 and 15. Why are they seeing light sources well down below the fire floors? I saw low-level flashes. With each popping sound, initially an orange and then a red flash came out of the building. Then it would just go around the floors on all sides. What are we seeing here on the South Tower? Is it similar to a controlled demolition on the left? Given that no steel frame high-rise has ever collapsed due to fire, is it prudent to at least analyze the hypothesis of explosive controlled demolition, given that it looks exactly like one? I saw a flash, flash, flash. Then it looked like the building came down. I thought the terrorist planted explosives somewhere. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. All of these witnesses were reported to NIST. None of them were reported in the final report by NIST. What did these guys say?
Floor by floor instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah, detonated.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
Mr. Mohr, 2 minutes in response.
Okay, I actually think that our eyewitness accounts can give us some very good evidence for natural collapse. First of all, 72% of them, as you can see on the slide that's about to come up, smelled jet fuel in the stairwells, and that's a very, very important fact. But what I think is most important is the randomness of the eyewitness accounts. If there were a controlled demolition, there would be, along with it, there would be a pattern to this. The people would be seeing and hearing the same kinds of things. The eyewitnesses' accounts of explosions talk about fireballs. It talks about little flashes of light, the ground shaking with no other apparent effect or no change in the structure. People like eyewitness Philip Morell explained the cause of the ground shaking in the basement, which he first thought may have been some kind of explosion, as a freight elevator crashing. And that, by the way, in 9/11 Mysteries, that part of it was edited out, I might add. Movies like that do edit out parts of the interviews sometimes. Other random explosions follow the appearance of white smoke. White smoke kills dozens of firefighters every year. And so we have a lot of problems with just saying that, yes, of course there were eyewitnesses that were reporting explosions, but the most important thing is that there's no seismic evidence of any major explosions. We have the seismic evidence shows 2 planes crashing into the buildings. Nothing. And then the 2 crashes and the collapses of the buildings. Those are seismic events that are major explosions. Explosions happen in fires all the time. Firefighters die from natural causes, from natural fire explosions of all different kinds. Firefighters' accounts, almost all of them, are of sounds around the collapse time and not before the collapse time. Some explosions from the fuel in the elevator shafts and in the basements, like I was talking about before. And we really do have to watch out for that white smoke. That is actually evidence, and it can sometimes be a not very hot smoke. That white smoke is something that happens right before an explosion that has caused the tragic loss of life of many, many firefighters in our country.
Mr. Gage, 2 minutes.
In fact, we have
I'm sorry. This is
our
now the 1 minute back and forth.
In fact,
sorry about that, Mr. Timer.
In fact, Chris, there is plenty of evidence to suggest there were explosions before the jet plane impacts, as well as before the collapse of the towers. And these explosions that are occurring at the onset of destruction are uniform, evenly paced, and not as easily picked up by seismic devices.
Well, anything that's not picked up by these seismic devices, some of the portable seismic devices were right in the area, not far away, and then there was a major seismic device that was only 30 miles away. That was close enough. If they were not big enough to be registered on the seismic record, they're not big enough to cause a structural problem in the building.
Also, we have only one witness smelling kerosene throughout the building.
And the other 72% were smelling what?
I don't know what they were smelling.
That's what NIST says, that they were smelling jet fuel.
But I challenge your facts in that case.
That's because it came from NIST.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. Next question, and I again remind you, this order was agreed upon by both our debaters, is to Richard Gage. Molten steel, iron microspheres. You claim that there was molten metal below the wreckage piles and tiny iron microspheres found in the dust, both of which indicate a controlled demolition. Why couldn't these things happen from the fires in the towers?
Well, let's take a look. In fact, this is another point of evidence for explosive controlled demolition, because we do not have the heat that's capable of developing molten iron or steel pouring out of the South Tower 10 minutes prior to its collapse. This is clearly not any other metal than iron or steel, because we know because of the color. Aluminum from the jet planes is what we were told by NIST, and yet what happens when we have melted airplane is that it's silvery in color. It doesn't glow bright orange like that. So we know this is not aluminum from the jet plane. Who's attributed to have said after 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten metal was still running? Leslie Robertson. His associate, Richard Garlock, says the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. Literally molten steel, says the president of the company. Steel flowed in molten streams. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. And these gentlemen, what did they experience?
See, molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
From a volcano.
Structural engineers like Abelhaz and Astani documented the melting of girders in the debris pile, in this case under World Trade Center 7. FEMA, the original writer of the first report, the BPAT report came out in May of 2002, documents the melting of steel with hot sulfur corrosion attack. Steel takes, as my opponent mentioned, 2,700 degrees to melt. The fires and the jet fuel, which is only kerosene basically, can only get to be about 1,600 degrees. That's it. It doesn't melt steel, making it look like Swiss cheese. We have rapid oxidation, sulfidation, hot sulfur, molten iron, they document. Not even melted steel, invading the grain boundaries of the steel.
Mr. Gage, time up. Mr. Mohr, your response.
Well, first of all, that image of the molten debris that's coming out of the side of the building, what a coincidence that a big giant aluminum plane went into that hole and then about an hour later some molten something came out. Richard would deny that is aluminum. This is not aluminum coming out of a foundry. I want to remind you that this is a soup that's mixed up with office furniture and curtains and tens of thousands of sheets of burning paper and all those kinds of things. So of course it's going to be discolored. That's natural.
Okay, we can go again. Yeah, go ahead. That's all we can do. Good.
I mean, that's always going to happen. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that the NASA thermal images that Richard likes to talk about and others show 1,400 degree temperatures in the debris. That would be very consistent with melted aluminum, just as an example. We have 1,000 cars in the parking garage. All that Alcoa aluminum on the outside is the outside coating of the building. On every single floor, enormous amounts of aluminum, and that could have created those pools of molten steel, quote unquote. I'm not denying that the witnesses saw that. Some people have tried to deny that, but I don't think that's a very smart way to go. It was there. It was definitely there, but it did not exceed 1,400 degrees. It was not molten steel. When we get into sulfidation of steel, that is a bit of a complex thing. When sulfur and steel become a eutectic mixture, what happens is that the melting point of that eutectic steel goes way down because it retards the crystallization. I don't want to get too technical, but the result of that is that the steel that has been sulfidized then has a melting point, depending on who you talk to, of somewhere around 1,500 to 1,800 degrees. So, just kind of keep in mind that kind of steel can melt. There's no doubt about that. And so I just wanted to mention that. Steel from the burning floors, we can see here's the 1,400 degrees that I was talking about before in those examples here. And so I just think I'll stop. Oh, I have to stop anyway. Okay.
All right, gentlemen, 1 minute.
Well, in fact, let's see what analysis shows. This is clearly what you're seeing on the slide now is molten iron, not even molten steel. It's a chunk of molten iron. Tests are performed on it, electron microprobe data, and they rule out aluminum from the jet planes. In fact, they rule out structural steel, and it has aluminum, sulfur, and potassium in it. Fluorine and manganese. These are the chemical ingredients of thermite, and thermite can be put into patented devices which are made of consolidated thermite, where the cutting charge itself, you said no evidence, the cutting casing itself decomposes and ignites and releases molten iron, as a matter of fact.
I'd actually have to look more. I'll have to be honest with you. The evidence of molten iron itself is not something that I've researched enough to be able to rebut for you.
Well, I think that's a great example of the forthrightness that our debaters are bringing to the debate. We've got one more question in this section, and it also goes to Richard Gage. Nanothermitic composite incendiaries in the World Trade Center dust. Mr. Gage, you point to a controversial scientific paper which claims to have found the presence of unexploded red-gray chips of nanothermite. Couldn't this just be paint chips from the destroyed buildings?
Well, let's take a look first. But let me note that there is no explanation from the official side for all of the molten iron at the site. Let's look at some more examples. What do officials, the USGS, R.J. Lee, find billions of previously molten iron microspheres, the diameter of a human hair? They find it in all of the dust. Again, it comes up to a magnet, because it's iron. What do they find in these? R.J. Lee finds that it is molten iron, previously molten iron. How did it get there? If you had thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building, and under explosive conditions, that would be dispersed. The byproduct of liquid of thermite is liquid molten iron. When a liquid is dispersed, it forms what? Spheres, billions of them. They cool and they fall with all of the dust. There's no other explanation tonight, tomorrow night, or for the last 10 years for these iron-rich microspheres found in the World Trade Center dust. Here's thermite going off. What do we find?
Thermite reaction that forms into a sphere roughly due to surface tension, and those solidify in the air. And so all that information is preserved in the dust.
Not only is it preserved in the dust, but it has the chemical analysis of ignited thermite as well. As do the unignited thermite chips found, these red-gray particles, red on one side, gray on the other, found by this international team of scientists in every one of the 4 samples they collected in and around ground zero. 1/16 of an inch long, red on one side, gray on the other. They have the chemical evidence of thermite. This is what's analyzed: aluminum, sulfur, iron, etc. The red side we zoom into 50,000 times. What do we see? Tiny nanoparticles of thermite, intimately mixed with nanoparticles of aluminum. This is extremely sophisticated material made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories.
Time up,
it should
Mr.
not
Gage.
be found in the World Trade Center dust.
Before we allow Chris Mohr's response, I'm going to invoke moderator privilege here and ask Mr. Gage to refrain from attempts at mystifying the audience. That was a missed joke. Anyway. We're getting at that point in the proceedings.
Yes, we're getting punchy.
Now for Chris Mohr's response.
Well, actually, and this is an honest question, Richard. Later on when we talk together, I'd like to ask about how much of that molten iron was in there, because is it tons and tons and tons, or are there just a few examples of that? But we will get to that in our discussion back and forth. These iron microspheres have been quite baffling to me, actually, at first. And NIST, I talked to them about the iron microspheres on the phone and in emails, and they said, well, there's no chain of custody for the samples, that it was out there with those guys like Stephen Jones, and therefore we can't trust it. I actually kind of do trust it. I wouldn't say 100%, but I'd say there's a good chance that those are authentic samples that he collected, having looked at the information. I've heard debunkers speculate that the microspheres are from extensive torch cutting of the debris following the collapse. I've determined that that's extremely unlikely based on how that dust was collected. I've heard about combusted coal from the residue of the original concrete, printer toner. I have also heard small pockets of intense heat. All of these claims I've been unable to validate. I looked at every single one of them, and I just came up dead. NIST also said that a dust analysis would not necessarily be conclusive, that the metal compounds would also have been present in the construction materials making up the World Trade Center. Sulfur is present in the gypsum wallboard, for example, and there's a lot of other things like that as well. The best answer that I can come up to about the presence of the iron microspheres is this. This building was put together with tens or hundreds of thousands of weldings of steel. And when those welders were in there, they were bringing it up to very, very high temperatures to weld the steel together. And as a result of that, back in 1972 and 1973, enormous numbers of iron microspheres were created by the original construction crews with all their welding torches. So I want to ask you, Richard, if you think there's any possibility that the iron microspheres just could have come from that.
Fair question. We have, in fact...
1 minute, please, gentlemen, between the two of you.
Yeah.
A fair question. We have evidenced in the spheres that were analyzed by the USGS of the same chemical analysis that we have in spheres that were produced by thermate. So they have aluminum, manganese, etc. Relative to the tons of molten iron, here's just two examples of thick meteorites that weighed at least a couple of tons each. In addition to that, we have...
And how does that compare, while you're doing this, to the billion pounds of building that we started out with? How many? Do we have a few tons of this? Is that what you're saying?
Well,
there's enough evidence for global nanothermitic collapse? I don't think so.
There's evidence for 10 tons of iron spheres. In fact, there's 6% of the dust by R.J. Lee's analysis is these iron spheres.
That doesn't seem enough to justify a global collapse.
All right, we're going to have to leave it at that. This concludes the question portion of Section 1 concerning the Twin Towers. Both of our debaters now have 3 minutes to summarize their positions. And again, by prior agreement, we'll start first with Mr. Chris Mohr.
And I apologize here. Here we go. I'm ready. Okay. Well, we're going to be taking a break in just a couple minutes, but Osama bin Laden said on video that he was behind the 9/11 attacks. Now, this is that picture of the face, pretty grainy, as you know, and you always see it very grainy, of the fake fat bin Laden. But in fact, the original video, to me, he looks pretty skinny, as you can see here. That's the skinny bin Laden that I'm used to. Terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in 1993. They finished the job in 2001. We did not find physical evidence of actual detonation materials or anything like that would be used to set off explosions in a building. And in this era of WikiLeaks and all the other blogs and everything that are out there, not one whistleblower who's really on the inside of this supposed thing has brought any smoking gun information forward. The scientific evidence strongly points almost universally accepted theory of natural collapse. Now, you've been alone watching this debate for this part of it so far. Maybe something one of us said challenged your beliefs, and now you have a choice. If you believe Richard, and his website will reassure you that your beliefs are correct and that he will probably have rebuttals for everything that I've said here today. So you can take that. You can take my sources home. If you believe me, you can go to the debunker sites. You can just take my sources that I have there. That can validate what you're saying. But what I would encourage you to do, if you agree or tend to agree with Richard Gage, look at my sources and see that I have a lot of information there. I don't want you to become yet another statistic in that attitude polarization study and use this debate as your opportunity to strengthen your pre-existing convictions. That's not what this debate is about. This debate is about opening our minds to other possibilities. We're on the CU campus here in Boulder, and it's wonderful that we're here. There are thousands of physics majors and engineering students that are right here on campus. You can ask any of them if a structure could be built that is 95% air and can resist 180 million pounds crashing down on it at 100 miles an hour. They might laugh. A lot of them laughed at me when I asked that, but I said, look, I'm sorry, I'm debating a guy who doesn't believe that, and I have to get this information. And I got it from 13, 14 different physicists, including other physicists who are right there on a chat site as well. I can't find anybody who disagrees with the power of gravity in that way. Now, at the same time, I try to hold my opinions lightly. I could be wrong about some of this stuff. And so I always have to ask myself, and all of us should do this too, are we really being truthful at the level of our heart? Can we always be open to reconsidering our entrenched positions and find something perhaps that's a little bit greater than our own certainties? I hope and pray that whatever we believe, that we respect those we disagree with, as Richard and I really respect one another. We genuinely like one another. And that really is love. And I hope that our hearts find peace so that we can share it with those of us and the whole world that is so sorely in need of it. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to speculate about Osama bin Laden or whistleblowers. I'm going to talk about the evidence found at in the debris and in the eyewitness testimony, including the 10 features of explosive controlled demolition, which we have documented very carefully, all of which is direct evidence of explosive controlled demolition, none of which can be accounted for by fire, not any of them. So when you fill out your forms, your audience survey poll today, I'm going to ask you to consider, was I convinced that the World Trade Centers were explosively demolished? I believe that they were in an extremely explosive controlled demolition. My opponent is unable to account for many of the physical impossibilities and severe problems with the official account of events of the Twin Towers destruction, highlighted in this 3-year, $20 million, 10,000-page cover-up of the crime of the century. NIST refused to seriously consider the most likely hypothesis of explosive controlled demolition, even though the National Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, NFPA 921, requires such investigation given the overwhelming evidence, including high-order damage and blast pressure front effects, which we've documented. NIST neglected to test for explosives, thermite, or nanothermite residue, and still refused to today, even when having been confronted with the peer-reviewed papers documenting evidence of nanothermite found in the World Trade Center dust by scientists, the billions of previously molten iron microspheres found in the World Trade Center dust by officials, the hundreds of witnesses hearing sounds of explosions, seeing flashes of light hurled up at the onset of destruction, the heavy steel framing hurled up to 600 feet laterally at 70 to 80 miles an hour, the high-speed ejections of the building solids 20 to 40 stories below the crush zone, unnatural symmetrical debris distribution, mid-air pulverization of 90,000 tons of concrete and metal decking, the missing stacks of 110 floors in the debris piles, and the participation of their own leaders, NIST's own leaders, in the development of nanothermite itself. And NIST implicitly condoned the illegal destruction of 99% of the World Trade Center structural steel framing evidence before the early investigations were even complete, implicit due to their non-whistleblowing of that illegal act. In short, NIST's official technical explanation of the tower's collapse is inconsistent with the evidence and the basic laws of physics, and may be deliberately fraudulent. Since it is difficult to imagine how so many qualified engineers could make so many mistakes, by contrast, the hypothesis of explosive controlled demolition is consistent with all of the available evidence and the laws of physics. Under the description of the scientific method, we have no choice but to abandon the official account provided by NIST and to insist on a new investigation.
Thanks a lot. We're doing all right here. We'll see you guys soon.
Friends, I can tell you that while our two debaters are very, very well prepared, they are, for the most part, speaking extemporaneously. What do we say?
Thanks, you guys. Thanks.
Part 2 of this audio presentation, 9/11 debate, collapse by fire or explosive controlled demolition, featuring Chris Mohr and Richard Gage, now focuses on the third building to fall on September 11th, World Trade Center 7.
Welcome back, everybody. We are now going on to our second portion of today's debate, where we will deal exclusively with the collapse of the third tower in New York that day. Came down at 5:20 in the afternoon, and that was Building 7. Let's welcome back our two debaters. First, Mr. Chris Mohr. And Mr. Richard Gage, AIA.
Okay, ready to go.
I am now going to read a prepared statement that was jointly crafted by our two debaters, or they both had input in any case. And it will be to introduce the topic of this segment, Building 7. Here are 5 minutes of facts that our debaters agree on and want to share with you about the collapse of Building 7. World Trade Center Building 7 was a 47-story skyscraper about a football field in length away from the North Tower. There are both differences and similarities between Building 7 and the Twin Towers. Here are some of the differences. No plane hit Building 7. The Twin Towers suffered structural damage from plane crashes. Building 7 suffered non-significant, quote, non-significant structural damage from the debris that fell from the towers. The Twin Towers suffered an explosive collapse. Building 7's collapse was implosive. The fires in the Twin Towers had single sources when the planes crashed into the buildings. The fires in Building 7 had separate sources on separate floors. In November 2008, the National Institute of Standards and Technology issued its final report on Building 7. The report states, quote, "The collapse of World Trade Center 7 is the first known instance of a tall building brought down primarily by uncontrolled fires. The Twin Towers burned for under 2 hours each before collapsing. Building 7 got hit with burning debris at 10:28 a.m. and collapsed at 5:30 p.m. and according to NIST, burned for almost 7 hours. Now we will paraphrase the NIST report so we know what they claim. NIST explained that column 79 helped support the east penthouse of the building. Building 7 had a large open atrium in the lobby and was held up by columns and 3 complex truss systems. Here's a photo of column 79 and the nearby structure. NIST states that the, quote, normal office fires were the main reason for the collapse, along with the lack of water for the firefighters to fight it. Fires burned all afternoon, especially on the lower floors. Separate fires in World Trade Center 7 broke out on different floors, most notably on floors 7 to 9 and 11 to 13. Firefighters reported large gashes and fires in the south face of the building, But NIST states in their final report that there was not much structural damage. NIST claims that Building 7 collapsed because heat expanded the floor beams, and their unusual length magnified that effect. They also claim that connections between structural elements could not resist the effects of heat, and that the structure was not designed to prevent fire-induced progressive collapse. The north side perimeter showed fires only on a few floors, but NIST claims that fires were more extensive on the south side, which was hit by burning debris. NIST states that a girder on floor 13 lost its connection to a critical column, column 79, that provided support for the long floor spans on the east side of the building. The displaced girder caused floor 13 to collapse. Floor failures cascaded to the 5th floor. This collapse weakened column 79 over 9 stories. Column 79 then buckled and triggered an upward progression of floor system failures that reached the building's east penthouse. NIST asserts that the failure first occurred from floor 12 and then to the top of the building. Then all of the columns east to west failed in the core of the building. Finally, the entire facade collapsed at a nearly symmetrical 6-degree tilt. This series of structural failures, mostly invisible, I should say, very important, with the east penthouses seen collapsing first, then around 7 seconds with nothing visible on the north face. As evidence of the complete collapse of the penthouse and the structure beneath during those 7 seconds, NIST shows this photograph of light shining through the windows right after the east penthouse disappeared from view. By visual observation, NIST acknowledges that the building's exterior facade fell at less than free fall acceleration for 1.5 seconds, then at approximately free fall acceleration for 2.25 seconds, through a distance of approximately 8 stories, which would be 32 meters or 105 feet. The entire facade collapsed downward as a single unit in 6.5 seconds. NIST also performed a computer analysis of what an explosive demolition might have looked like. These diagrams show NIST's speculation that many more broken windows, much louder sounds, and a different pattern of destruction would have been observed. Other scientists and institutions, each with their own expertise, has proposed variations on NIST's proposed causes and sequence of the collapse of the collapse of Building 7, including Arthur Sherman, Ryan Mackey, the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, the University of Edinburgh, and ARUP. Now, we're going to go right into our format that we had before. Questions for each of our debaters. Again, the order these questions are derived in were come up with jointly by our 2 debaters. So then, first we're going to go to Richard Gage and his critique of the NIST explanation. Mr. Gage, that just sounded like a pretty reasonable explanation, which most people believe. Why don't you go along with it?
Here's the problem that I have with the NIST explanation. It's lacking the acknowledgement of all of the evidence for explosive controlled demolition found at the site from the eyewitness testimony and the debris pile and the chemical analysis, all of which are features of explosive controlled demolition. In this case, not as explosive as the Twin Towers, where everything blew outside the footprint. In this case, it's a perfect implosion, as quoted by FEMA. We have each of the features of explosive controlled demolition, so we're going to break this down into subjects. Fire can't account for any one of these features, let alone all 10 of them. So the question for you tonight is this proof of explosive controlled demolition? Let's start with explosive demolitions. We know how they behave because we have hundreds of examples from all across the country from which to draw our comparison. This is an explosive controlled demolition. We have a near freefall collapse caused by the destruction of the structural components inside the building, starting with the interior columns progressing outward, starting with the floor progressing upward, where the columns are taken out virtually simultaneously. This produces a symmetrical collapse at near freefall acceleration because we've removed that resistance. So, we know an explosive controlled demolition when we see one. The question for you is this an explosive controlled demolition?
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
Let's take another look. East penthouse first,
Richard, that's
second before, and the rest of it comes down at near free fall symmetrically.
It's gone, man.
Now to Chris Mohr for his rebuttal.
Well, first of all, so many people, when I express my skepticism about the controlled demolition, say, what about Building 7? And we're finally talking about it. I didn't talk about it in my first debate, so I'm glad to be doing it here. Scientific debate has been raging about Building 7. I shouldn't say raging, that's an exaggeration. But the structural engineers and physicists who have studied this is, by the way, not a scientific debate. I'm not a scientist. I'm coming at this as a journalistic person. Richard has a lot more training than I do, but neither of us really has all the training we need to do the hard science on this. These computer simulations that NIST did are way more advanced than were available in the 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s. In fact, even in the year 2001, these kinds of simulations were not available as part of the technology of the time. There are 6 different natural collapse theories that I've seen so far. Some of them talk about not only do the steel beams expand more, but then after they cool off when the fire moves somewhere else, they sag and then they contract, and the contracted sagging steel brings things back together even more for more of the inward bowing there. So that pulls in on the exterior supports even more. NIST has given some advice. We have to realize that one of the reasons that NIST did this, the main reason that NIST does this, whenever there's a catastrophic disaster of some kind, NIST is empowered to study it and to make recommendations about future things to do. And right now they're advising against unsupported long strut building designs in the future. The recommendations have been taken up by the International Code Council and the National Fire Protection Association. So there's quite a bit of that. Again, I've been confused. I actually just found out from Richard that he thinks the thermates were used here, which are hot but not as explosive, and the thermites, or nanothermites rather, were used in the towers. So I keep finding new information like that. But one of the things that I wonder about with these findings, I know you completely disagree with the findings of how this building collapsed. Do you also oppose the building and fire and safety recommendations that NIST has released in these reports?
Well, we have 1 minute now for the two of you to discuss that. Perhaps Richard would like to start.
In fact, I do. There are billions of dollars that are spent needlessly as a result of the recommendations that NIST forced on, or that were forced in effect on several other building codes.
Well, that would scare me if you won that argument.
It's needless. And architects and engineers, 1,400 of us, are crying for a new investigation. We're crying out to understand how this collapse looks so much like an explosive demolition. Let's take a look. Let's take a look. Let's take a look. Let's take a different look.
That's my side. We need to go to Richard's side. We should give him a few seconds for this.
There we go.
That's still my side, everybody. I'm not going to enforce the 0 seconds on you, Richard. That wouldn't be fair.
You're a sweetheart, Chris. How come, Chris, they look so similar? Wouldn't you want a new investigation since they look, World Trade Center 7 and another known controlled demolition look almost exactly alike?
You know, you never play the sound on track on these, do you? Why not?
Well,
because they sound completely different.
Well, of course they do. One is high-energy explosives. One is thermite, which doesn't have the loud bang.
So these are different kinds of collapses in one way or another.
It's a deceptive controlled demolition. That's why we find pools of molten iron underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, gentlemen, we just got word in from Congress. They gave us an earmark to be able to extend that, and Richard did get some of his time back after all. All right, then. Now we are going to go to Chris Mohr with a question as follows. It's about the fires in World Trade Center 7, the number and the size and the duration. Mr. Mohr, the fires in Building 7 seem to be regular office fires without jet fuel. How could they have been big enough to bring down that building?
Well, that's a good question, obviously, and it was the one that NIST had to work on for a very, very long time, because it's true that the airplanes didn't come crashing in there. One of the things that I've been kind of struck by is that when I watch the videos of both Richard Gage and others, that have put out these various videos, Stephen Jones and others, that I usually see that New York Police Department north side thing, but there are many pictures of much, much more damage on this. The World Trade Center had its origin on 10 different floors of where it began the fires. The water supply to fight the fires in World Trade Center was impaired, and there were no efforts made to fight the fires. And when you see these pictures on the other side, they are really raging. Eyewitness Chris Bull, a firefighter, said it was a huge hole right in the middle of it. Here we have responders walking through the nice, cool debris pile while Building 7 fire is raging on. You can see smoke pouring out of most of the floors here. And you can see also what happens with the debris and how it affects it. It's very, very serious. Let me hit this again. Here it is coming down. Of course, this is the tower now coming down, and it's sending a lot of debris over onto Building 7. We can also see more of that kind of thing happening in here. You can see how much the debris, much of that burning coming right on. You can see damage to the building. It wasn't structural damage, but there was a lot of damage that would be caused with the burning. We can also see other kinds of... Now, why is that happening? Oh, there we go. Okay. This is an ABC film shortly before the collapse that shows a tremendous amount of damage here. And we see over and over again, we see slides from the other side that show that problem of there being a lot more damage than is shown in your typical videos from the 9/11 Truth Movement. Here is just a few more to kind of keep us going here. These pictures and videos from the north face don't show much damage, but this is a whole different thing. Now, I know that Richard would say that these pictures show smoke but no fire, but I would say that where there's smoke, especially when it's on most of the floors like it is here, that now that fire has gone into the middle of the building, and that's very, very important to know because that's where the collapse actually started.
Richard, 2 minutes to respond.
Wouldn't we expect that if there were lots of fire damage and lots of debris damage on the south side of the building, that the building would have fallen toward its injured side? Does it do that? No. In fact, we have only small fires on the north side, and these are the largest fires we have evidence for, actually. And Appendix L of the draft report from NIST shows that these fires were out by 4:45 in the afternoon. Now, how can they have caused the initiation of collapse on the 12th floor around column 79 when they were out at least a half hour to 45 minutes prior to that collapse? NIST says this whole building came down due to the failure of a single column, this one here, because of the thermal expansion of these. Well, how can they expand thermally when they are fireproofed and protected from that expansion? When they have shear studs that are tied into the composite metal decking? Why did NIST falsify the records by applying the heat load in their computer models to these beams, all of them in just 1.5 seconds, forcing them inside the computer model to expand at an abnormal rate independently from the slab on top, the concrete slab, which they did not apply any heat to? This is falsification, fraudulent use of science. It should not be allowed. Look at the computer animation. 400 structural steel connections failing per second, like you're spraying water on a sandcastle. That's the rate of failure in what really is a redundant designed steel structure system that should not be failing like this. They won't even show us the rest of the collapse. It stops after a couple of seconds.
Thank you, Richard.
And it begins to tip over, unlike the videos showing a straight-down symmetrical collapse at free fall.
All right. Our next question.
I'm
sorry. I was so entranced by the video. We got our 1 minute back and forth for the both of you on this.
Well, first of all, I'm stunned at the suggestion that the fires were almost out right before the collapse. That completely blows my mind and goes against all those videos and pictures that I show. And briefly, as far as the fireproofing, NIST said that since the fireproofing was painted on as opposed to the steel or rather concrete reinforcement that is typical in large buildings, that's something they're kind of recommending against. They're also recommending against these long struts that are allowed to expand in a way that lesser struts don't tend to do. These are safety recommendations. I am very, very glad for those safety recommendations. I feel a lot safer because those recommendations have been made. I don't think it's a waste of money. My life isn't a waste of money.
Well, the fires were out on the 12th floor where the initiation of collapse was said to have begun by NIST. They acknowledge this in their draft report. Check it out. Also, regarding the damage, NIST suggests that the damage is insignificant, not a causative factor. Neither was diesel fuels, by the way. It was the normal office fires that brought the building down.
All right, thank you. Our next question goes to Richard Gage, and it concerns the characteristics of collapse, the near symmetrical destruction. Mr. Gage, you claim that Building 7 came straight down, and it indicates controlled demolition. Why couldn't this happen as a natural collapse?
Well, it can't happen because, as this NIST computer model shows, they can't even get their own computer model to behave the way a controlled demolition behaves. So they stop it after about 2 seconds. They won't even show us the collapse, nor will they release the input data. It can't happen because the perimeter wall unit, the perimeter wall structure of this building would deform as the internal collapse, which they allege is happening. It would have pulled in those perimeter wall units. It can't happen because the building falls straight down into its own footprint. A building would have fallen over due to natural causes in an organic collapse.
You still have some more time if you'd like to use it.
I yield my time.
Probably you won't get it back. All right, then. We now get 2 minutes of rebuttal from Chris Mohr.
Okay. As far as the whole symmetrical destruction question, and also I know one of the things that Richard loves to talk about is the path of most resistance. It keeps falling through the path of most resistance. That's what gravity does. It pushes things straight down towards the center of the earth. In the Royal Gorge right here in Colorado, the stream that is only a few miles from relatively flat territory pushed its way through the path of most resistance with that flat terrain nearby because gravity kept pushing it down as the uplift happened. So the path of most resistance is not really all that's going on. The second thing is that it takes a lateral force to push things off to the side. You can't just have something that says, well, this would be the path of least resistance, so I'll go over here. You need a lateral force to push it over here. A real good example of a lateral force is an earthquake. Many pictures that I have here are good examples of earthquakes that have lateral force in them that push the buildings over to the side. That's why we expect it in that situation. Thomas Eagar said the building is 95% air. It can implode into itself. A large structure has too much inertia to fall down in any other direction except nearly straight down. Michael Brown pointed out that the collapses for all the buildings began where they were tilted towards that weakened collapse point. In this case, the weakened collapse point was the east penthouse, and it did tilt 6 degrees into that, but most of it was an internal collapse, and then finally the perimeter collapsed after that. The other thing that kind of blows my mind about this falling into its own footprint sort of thing, these are the sloppiest controlled demolitions in history. I don't know what is going on. Obviously, Tom Sullivan must not have been involved in these because these things have a 16-acre debris pile. There's stuff flying all over the place in every direction, and that is not characteristic of a successful controlled demolition. We can see it tilting a little bit to there. This particular one, there's interesting problems because at least on the north face, we don't see squibs, we don't see dust ejection. We see a building that's wider than it is high in some ways in one direction. And again, as I said, it didn't fall into its own footprint. It caused horrible damage to the Verizon building especially.
Gentlemen, 1 minute.
The building falls to the path of least resistance after that resistance is removed. As you'll see on the slide here, we have 80 columns. In order to bring a building straight down uniformly into its own footprint, all of those columns have to be removed virtually simultaneously. Otherwise, the building will begin to tip over, as it does in the example of every fire-induced collapse of a building.
But in the inside of the building, it's this mess of collapsing, and 79 is one of the very last columns to go, Richard. It's not, before that, there are other columns that are collapsing one after another. It's all happening with the outside perimeter somehow holding itself together until the very end. It was a very asymmetrical collapse in that the middle of it was a complete mess of one column after another until nothing was left to support it at all.
The main penthouse falls a second before the overall, indicating those core columns were cut virtually simultaneously.
And now we're going to go to our next question, and it is for Mr. Chris Mohr. Chris, again, speaking about the characteristics of the collapse and free fall acceleration, it is acknowledged by NIST that for a portion of the time the building fell at the free fall acceleration. This, by intuition, would lead one to think that there was a controlled demolition involved. What do you say for that?
I asked NIST this repeatedly, and I asked several people at NIST. I also sent them emails. The email I got back didn't really acknowledge that there was much of a problem there. So that was frustrating in terms of creating a narrative about how free fall collapse is possible in this situation. The bottom line of what NIST said really was building, gravity, collapse. You know, they basically said it doesn't matter if it's free fall or very nearly free fall for any of the buildings. And the reason they say that is because and then they much more politely said to me, there is so much overwhelming force that is bringing it down that free fall is not a problem. I talked to some other people to get a better sense of that, and we can see a little bit of that on this video here too. Let's watch this very, very carefully. This is where we see, first of all, the east penthouse beginning its collapse. And is that going? There it goes. It is going. Okay. It takes 7 or 8 seconds after the east penthouse collapse, and then there's this buckling that happens that is almost invisible over many floors. That collapse loaded the next column, and it fails, and then the next column, and so on, until the entire core is destabilized and it falls in on itself. When the east penthouse fell downward into the building, you can see sunlight through the windows because the roof was gone. Other windows broke out on the north face at the ends of the building core as the perimeter wall was being damaged. And then it is literally, there's one perimeter, when the perimeter is left, it is literally pulled down by an 8-story section of the interior that didn't detach during the core collapse. So there's one small part of it that is going at free fall because this thing is yanking it down. And then it goes back to less than free fall. It starts at less than free fall. It ends at less than free fall. For 2.25 seconds, that 8-story core thing is pulling it down. The previous second from the roof line, you see a buckling, and you can kind of look at that as like a long stick that you may have. You can kind of push it down, and it bends, and then crack, and it goes, and then you fall at free fall to the ground.
When a column buckles, the absolute minimum resistance it will give is 25%. There's engineering data on this for many years, many decades. So with the minimum resistance of 25% of the intact column strength, if those columns had a bare minimum of a 2-to-1 factor of safety, which would be absolute minimum, that building could not fall in a natural way at any greater than half the rate of gravity. So the fact that it's falling in free fall means those columns are gone. There is no structural integrity. They cannot happen naturally. There's no chance. And nobody will ever produce a test to show that because that could happen with a structure with any kind of integrity, because it can't happen.
I think the key there, Chris, is that you push it down, you push it down, you push it down. Unfortunately, nothing's pushing back up in the case of Building 7. The overwhelming force there is not what's coming down. It's the 40,000 tons of structural steel that's 5 times stronger than it needed to be to resist that pushing down. But all of a sudden, the building starts uniformly, symmetrically, there 1 second, and then as we observe, the perimeter structure falls with no resistance. Where did the 40,000 tons of structural steel go? All those columns had to have been cut virtually simultaneously around the perimeter for that building to come down so fast. Take a look here. The building's gaining downward momentum with every second, indicating the force of gravity is unresisted for those 8 stories.
All right, gentlemen, now you've got 1 minute to go back and forth. Richard, again, you've got a minute left if you'd like to continue.
I yield my time.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I would like to suggest that we can come up to the slide here. Once that perimeter does collapse, something amazing happens. You can see it on the slide that's about to come up here. There's no evidence of 4,500 degree thermites or thermates or nanothermites or anything else blowing this face apart. It just kind of buckles over, and you can see it in that picture there. Also, if we go to the next one, from the top, you can see that the whole thing just kind of folds itself over the top. There's a certain amount of integrity that perimeter had. So that's one of the things I want to mention. Also, 5 times maybe the static load, but when you have an active load of gravity pushing things down with the massive amounts of weights that we're talking about with all of these buildings, Richard, it just doesn't work out that way. Can you explain that? I mean,
yeah. How does the active load generate at free fall acceleration with no transition from point 0 to free fall?
It doesn't go that way. It goes
down.
slower than free fall, and then it eventually hits free fall, and then it goes slower than free fall again.
Not so. NIST claims there's a slower than free fall, but the building is stationary until all of a sudden it's in full free fall. You can see it in the videos.
All right. Now our next question concerns the molten metal found in the debris pile and FEMA's Appendix C, and it goes to Mr. Gage. Mr. Gage, apparently the structural steel suffered some severe heat and corrosion. Why can't that happen as a result of office fires?
Would you repeat the question, please, Tom?
Yes, I hope I have it right here. Apparently, the structural steel suffered some severe heat and corrosion. Why can't that happen as a result of office fires?
Office fires produce about office fires produce about 1,400 to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. They don't produce the temperatures required to melt steel. And yet, FEMA documents in their Appendix C of the BPAT report that came out in May of 2002 very clear documentation of the melting of steel. So what melted the steel? They or my opponent have no explanation for the melting of steel. And the hot sulfur corrosion attack documented by FEMA with intergranular melting. What does that mean? Molten iron is seen documented invading the grain boundaries of the steel. Where did the molten iron come from? There's been no explanation for this from NIST or from my opponent. The molten iron is the byproduct of thermite. Scientists find the signature of thermite in the molten iron. These chunks of steel from Building 7, in fact, the only chunk of steel saved from the illegal destruction of 99% of the evidence, the structural framing of Building 7, they document themselves this hot sulfur corrosion attack. Sulfur doesn't come from this calcium sulfate in the gypsum board. It's an inert bonded ingredient. Gypsum board is designed to protect structural steel. It has never attacked it before. So all of a sudden we have unexplained molten steel and molten iron. We have unexplained chemical evidence of thermate, which is thermite plus added sulfur, which makes a eutectic designed to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. This all remains unexplained, and it is causative of the free fall acceleration of Building 7 down.
Mr. Gage, time up. Now, Chris Mohr for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you. There's some very interesting things to talk about here. First, I just wanted to say that I'm very glad that this is a picture that's about to come up that a lot of people have seen in the movement. It's not being used anymore by Stephen Jones or Richard Gage, to their credit. This was originally used as evidence of molten metal in the debris, and I'm only bringing it up because people need to know that if you think that was evidence, this is actually that molten metal and debris. No, it's actually just a flashlight, which you'll get to see here while I'm talking. There is also that slide of that weird meteorite thing, which I'm going to show you in just a second. It was very, very dense. I think there was probably some sulfidized stuff in there too, and that is really problematic. So the question is, what is that? And just a second here. I'm going the wrong direction. Okay, so this meteorite that is oftentimes used as evidence of some kind of intense temperature and that sort of thing, let's focus in a little bit, and we see scraps of unburned paper crushed into that meteorite. So how does very, very hot thermites or nanothermites or thermates fit in with that? But I think one thing that is very, very important is that FEMA did have a report about sulfidized steel. It remains a mystery. We don't know where that came from. We do know that sulfidized steel can create molten steel at 1700, 1800 degrees. We don't know the source of it. It's not accurate to say that it came, as Richard said, and he's right, it's not accurate to say that it came from things like the gypsum. That has been claimed, but it's actually not true. It's very, very unlikely that it happened there. I will say that it's localized, these pockets of sulfidized steel. It's not universal throughout, and so it doesn't really explain a global process of any kind. And the other thing about the sulfidized steel is that in a way, it's like, yes, there are some things that haven't been fully explained, but that doesn't mean, therefore it must be nanothermites. That's not logical.
Gentlemen, 1 minute.
Well, I'm glad to hear you acknowledge, Chris, that the molten metal, which turns out to be molten iron and steel, is not explainable, that the source of sulfur is not explainable from the building materials in the building. The question remains, what does it explain it? And so, as I suggested in my opener, I think the debate is already over.
I would beg to differ with you, and the reason for that is this assumption that we have. Well, okay, I can go home if you want, but I think I'm having too much fun up here, so I'm going to keep going with this. But this is an example of what I call reverse scientific method right here. We can't explain something; it's a scientific mystery. It must be nanothermites. It must be thermites. That is not a valid conclusion to jump to. There are, first of all, some things can't always be explained, but that doesn't mean that something that makes steel melt at 1400 to 1800 degrees suddenly becomes evidence of very, very hot nanothermites. I don't get it.
Well, that's 3 items of key specific evidence that are not explainable, that are key points of evidence that NIST chose to ignore, obfuscate, etc. So
thank you, Richard. I am amazed at the length of the sentences that we can come up with at the end of the allotted time. I'm having a hard time stepping on it, but to the credit to both of you. Okay, let's continue now. Eyewitness accounts of explosions and also World Trade Center 7. Mr. Gage, you claim that people heard explosions there as well during the collapses and that this indicates controlled demolition. Wouldn't this be happening when the buildings came down?
Well, one wouldn't expect massive explosions inside the building before the fires even got started.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions. What's the sound? Like a boom. Like an explosion.
And the first responder, whistleblower from New York Police Department, Craig Bartmer.
And the whole time you hear thum, 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 thum. So, I think I know an explosion when I hear it.
And Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! It has like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something.
And also in the vicinity of World Trade Center 7 in the afternoon, about 5 o'clock, this example.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Chris, are these floors falling in on themselves?
Richard, you've got 20 seconds left. You
yield my time.
Very good. Okay. You've got 2 minutes, Richard.
Yeah.
I mean, Chris.
Okay. I also looked at some of your eyewitness accounts, and of course there will be eyewitness accounts of explosions. I know Craig Bartner, who you mentioned you might be talking about, said he heard explosions at the onset of the collapse and not before. One of the challenges that really both of us face when it comes to eyewitness accounts is that unlike the laws of physics, the accounts often change. 6 years after 9/11 and weeks after an email hoax to Dylan Avery about a Building 7 countdown, Kevin McPadden came forth, and you can go on YouTube to see this, to say that, first of all, in his first little speech that I saw on YouTube, the firefighters got a vibe that Building 7 was coming down. There was something he couldn't exactly hear, but it sounded like a countdown. And then in the last few seconds, they just looked at him really weird. Well, that's then later, you have the testimony here that's months later where the testimony has really changed quite a bit at that point and has changed much more in favor of a controlled demolition and explosive kinds of things. Barry Jennings said that explosions in Building 7 were before the towers collapsed, and we saw his thing there. The other eyewitness who was physically present with him at the same time, and they went through this hell together, was Michael Hess, who agreed with him at first that the explosions happened ahead of time. And then he said to the BBC that the explosive sounds were tower debris hitting the building later in the day. So he changed his story. So now we have two people with contradictory stories. Tragically, first of all, Jennings got so many phone calls from 9/11 folks that at his job that he was almost fired. When he died, the cause of death was revealed only to his next of kin. Now, in my work, unfortunately, I've had to sit across from over 200 grieving families for funerals. I've seen families where the deceased had post-traumatic stress disorder from war and either drank themselves to death or had a drug overdose or committed suicide, otherwise died in ways that the family didn't want to reveal. Other families have kept the cause of death secret even for a simple heart attack or just to push away public brouhaha in the time of grief. Now, a 9/11 person did hire a private investigator, which honestly I consider to be unethical, and I really would hope that we were careful to respect the wishes of a grieving family in this situation.
Gentlemen, 1 minute for back and forth.
Let me switch gears and show you this slide, Chris. This is building number 5. It was fully engulfed in fire. Building 7 had a few isolated pockets of fire, which you're claiming brought it down by a natural collapse. Yet Building 5 didn't come down. How come it didn't come down?
First of all, it was a lot shorter, for starters. What was it, 12 stories or something?
Something.
It's almost like a whole different set of rules apply, and NIST has taught to me about this personally. The rules change when things get way, way, way bigger. They can't take a small model and then make it expand to a bigger model. This is a relatively small building, didn't have nearly as much weight pushing it down, and so I would say that would be my first answer off the top of my head. Any other questions?
And why was the evidence destroyed, shipped to China at 400 truckloads a day prior to the report coming out, which claimed that they needed the steel to examine because they had no idea how the building came down, the FEMA report?
Well, we're out of time. Frustrating. Please write that down as a question. I have an answer. This told me about that.
All right. We've got one more question in this segment, and then we'll go to the concluding remarks of our debaters.
We have two.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Access for secret preparation is next.
Okay. That one I don't have on my list. May I borrow yours?
Okay. Well, it's just that.
Would you care to read the question for me? I'm not sure which one it is.
Okay. Well, Chris, a lot of people have wondered, and it oftentimes is the first gut response that people have when they are first exposed to this idea. Well, how could so many controlled demolition devices be brought into these buildings secretly? And so, what do you have to say about that? So I'll answer that. If
I'm
that's
glad
okay.
I asked you that, Chris.
Yes.
Before you do, though, if you could repeat it for the DVD, that would be great. The question.
I'm sure it's fine for. Okay, I'm going to put it in my own words.
Yeah.
And the next question is for Chris Mohr. Chris, if a controlled demolition were to take place, it would involve a great deal of preparation prior. It appears that a controlled demolition took place to many people. How could that be vis-a-vis the preparation that would be required?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. If your gut tells you that would be impossible, my feeling is your gut is right. it would be impossible to secretly prepare for a controlled demolition in a building where 30,000 to 50,000 workers are coming and going day and night, working the New York, London, and Tokyo stock exchanges. And NIST says 1/4 of these survivors from 1993 were still working there. So there was a lot of stories about that first terrorist attack. This is a massively worried workforce of New Yorkers, for gosh sake. The tallest building ever demolished was 26 stories, and 12 people worked 24 days doing nothing but loading explosives. The World Trade Center, one tower would require 24 times more work per building, in secret, with tens of thousands of nervous workers around. Now, again, I went back to controlled demolition advocate Tom Sullivan, who talked about this, and he said that linear shape charges would be used. Now, as soon as he starts talking about that, because he thinks that would be necessary for the lateral ejection, I go, well, now you're dealing with welding torches and the smell and the noise of setup. That is not possible. The outer structure supports were right next to the most desirable office spaces on the outside. Explosives that are big enough to eject steel all this distance would have to be way too loud for any of the kinds of things that we heard on any of the videotapes. Remote controls in the core might be difficult for receiving radio signals. Creating shape charges, like I said, is noisy and smelly. And then it's just kind of a strange thing, because I've heard contradictory things, and maybe, Richard, you can help clarify this for me, because I don't understand it. Either it's a very small controlled demolition secret thing that happened with only 8 or 9 people who did, and everyone else was out of the loop, or it's a really big thing, and I hear accusations going against the mayor, the fire and the police chiefs, the building owner, the BBC, the phony man on the street interviews, several layers of the federal government. I'm sorry, I don't believe that. I don't believe that massive a conspiracy could possibly be pulled off secretly.
Well, let's take one possible look, Chris. Maybe we can figure something out. I agree with you that these buildings were among the most highly secure in the country, being next to the Pentagon. Building 7, for instance, had the CIA, the IRS, the Department of Defense, Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management. So we would expect that some conspirators would be getting together and would have to have the access through security. That security might be involved. Well, not only would security have to be involved, but some undercover operation that would be planting explosives. They would have gotten access, in fact, in an elevator modernization, which did occur in the 9 months prior to 9/11. Ace Elevator had this contract. They worked for 9 months, and in the largest modernization documented in elevator world in March of 2001. This would have given them intimate access to the core columns and beams in the structure, as many men and as much time as they needed. They scattered, as a matter of fact, when the first plane hit, they scattered, and it was quite a scandal documented by USA Today, because they are supposed to stay around and help the firefighters rescue these victims. They're experts in the delivery systems for those rescues. Where did they go? Relative to how these explosives might have been set, remote control operative systems are in place these days. We don't need miles of det cord and so forth. We have an unlimited budget in an undercover operation like this, assuming, as we are prone to in the 9/11 Truth Movement, that there was an inside operation of some sort. We don't know how high it was, how wide it was, but they must have had an unlimited budget. So we don't know the capability of the ignition devices that might have been used.
Thank
but
you,
we do
Richard.
know that they had the capability to survive fires because thermite are not set off by normal office fire temperatures.
Okay, before the 1 minute back and forth, a point of clarification I think is in order. While this segment is to be about Building 7, obviously we have strayed into the World Trade Center towers. But because both of our debaters did the straying, I'm going to allow it to stand. So you may continue back and forth.
Well, okay, first of all, obviously I can't possibly debate against some dark secret thing that is a technology that we don't know. I mean, that's out of the question. I do want to ask you, Richard, though, Do you think that it was just the core columns in the tower that had all this stuff happening? Because if so, that doesn't really explain the squibs. It doesn't explain the fact that these explosions were heading out in such a great distance. It doesn't explain the destruction of all the concrete and everything, the pulverization of all the concrete. Where do you think that these things, that all these things were secretly put?
Yeah, my speculation is that they were placed in the core, and that's why we have the massive explosive event in the Twin Towers, which is different than Building 7, because they had to have enough explosives in there to not only blow out the core, but the floors, and that extra force is what blew out the perimeter.
And those nice little tiny squibs that came out were because of the massive explosion that went off accidentally in the middle of the core?
We're going to have to leave it at that, because we have one more question here in this segment. It's going to go to Richard Gage, and it deals with foreknowledge of the World Trade Center 7 destruction. Mr. Gage, I hear that they knew in advance that Building 7 was going to collapse. There seems to be numerous examples of that.
Well, let's take a look. We have foreknowledge as one of our corroborative evidence points, including these mysterious construction workers and the police officer caught on CNN television, for which there's very little explanation other than advanced foreknowledge of explosions that are going on.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. Building is about to blow up. Move it back here. All right, guys? Sorry.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
Chris, why are these construction workers and police officers telling us that the building is about to blow up? And why is there a countdown here from Kevin
At
McPadden?
the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? I should go into that business. Why is the BBC announcing the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it happens? They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. Does that make them psychic? Why does CNN announce the collapse of the building at 11:07? Listen.
In New York, Alan Dobbs-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Aaron, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sabga and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick...
Why does the...
Richard, you're out of time. Sorry. And now Chris Mohr will respond for 2 minutes.
There was foreknowledge of destruction, and I want to show a slide, and this is worth a lot of time to read this. This is from Fire Chief Nigro. I feared a collapse of Building 7, as did many on my staff. The collapse of World Trade Center 1 damaged portions of the lower floors of 7. Building 7 was built on a small number of large columns, providing an open atrium on the lower levels. Fires on many floors of World Trade Center 7 burned without sufficient water supply to attack them. For these reasons, I made the decision, without consulting the owner, the mayor, or anyone else, as ranking fire officer. That decision was my responsibility, to clear a collapse zone surrounding the building and to stop all activity within that zone. Approximately 3 hours later, World Trade Center 7 collapsed. Conspiracy theories abound, and I believe firmly that all of them are without merit. Now, there are others. Deputy Fire Chief Peter Hayden, we have that here. We have another firefighter who said it was fully engulfed, the whole building. There were pieces of Tower 2 in Building 7 and the corners of the building missing. You could see flames going straight through from one side of the building to another. That's an entire block. Deputy Chief Peter Hayden, we saw the bulge in the southwest corner between floors 10 and 13. We were pretty sure she was going to collapse. At the edge of the south face, you could see it was very heavily damaged, said John Norman. Fire Captain Chris Boyle. Butch said, forget it. There's creaking. There are noises coming out of there. So we just stopped. And at 5:20, number 7 finally falls. There's a stampede. All these firefighters are waiting with their pickaxes and oxygen tanks to come in. And they're heading out towards the crushed fire trucks. They're looking for their brothers, says an ambulance driver. These firefighters, you know, they didn't hear Richard Gage's little mantra about how no steel frame building has ever collapsed. Hundreds of their brothers had just died. And they were looking at a structure that was also deforming, and they were using these very simple devices to determine that there was irregularities in the building, and just like they're so used to seeing buildings about to collapse, they see those kinds of structures falling apart, and they said it's going to go.
1 minute, please, back and forth.
If Building 7 was massively damaged on the south side, why did NIST come back and say that the damage was not a significant factor? The damage, the building, the onset of collapse started all the way on the back side of the building at column 79.
Well, okay, yeah, that's great. Sure, that there was not, NIST admitted, because they were being honest, that there was not major structural damage that caused this. But one of the things I want to say to you, Richard, stop beating up on this BBC reporter. She was sitting there saying, you know, look, you know, what we're getting is very, very sketchy, and she was right. She had a bunch of people, her colleagues were sitting there watching TV stations. They weren't getting first-hand information anymore. She said that the towers have collapsed, but the correct news was given by ABC News, and I was watching that, and ABC News said that the firefighters are saying it looks like it's going to collapse. So stop blaming her for that.
So how about CNN?
Same mistake.
The fires hadn't even started yet. There's no structural failure yet at 10:45 in the morning. Doesn't make sense. Was the building supposed to go down at 10:30, 10:45 in the morning? I mean, we wouldn't have seen the massive collapse.
These are rhetorical points, apparently, because our time is up for any answers on that. But we're going to concluding remarks. We'll start with 4 minutes from Chris Mohr.
I'm so grateful for all of you to be listening to us duke it out here for such a long time. I can't believe you're sitting here and listening to all of this. Thank you. This is not a scientific debate, as I've said before. I'm not a scientist. I put on my journalist hat. I investigated the scientific claims that Richard Gage is making very carefully and very seriously, and I've concluded that they have no foundation. The National Institute of Science, of Standards and Technology, issued their technical findings on the collapses of these buildings to determine the causes and to make recommendations for safety, fire code standards, and building standards. Now they're working on designs for reinforced elevators for tall buildings that would be safer than the stairwells that were used in the past. The International Code Council, the National Fire Protection Association, they were there for that. The people I've talked to and read are forensic analysts, fire chiefs, structural engineers, MIT physics professors, controlled demolition experts, scientists who answered my technical questions on a physics chat room, nationally recognized fire experts. I talked personally with 4 different NIST representatives. NIST scientists personally answered some of my questions. Add to that the 14 engineers and physics experts who I talked to personally. What they say makes sense to me. The science and the scientists themselves all around the world are overwhelmingly on the side of natural collapse. Every national structural engineering body in the world, including the American Society of Civil Engineers and Britain's Structural Engineering Institute, has accepted the technical findings of the 9/11 Commission and the FEMA and the NIST reports. The multi-year Purdue study and the Honolulu University studies also validated the NIST reports. Even the scientists who disagree somewhat with NIST offer only minor variations in their theories. Richard Gage has over 1,400 architects and engineers calling for an independent investigation. It's almost unimaginable but possible that virtually all of the physicists and structural engineers and scientists and hobbyists like myself who know science are wrong. But let's just say that we are wrong, because that could happen. Honestly, right now, with the information that we have and the science that I consider to be inadequate, there is not enough evidence that holds up to scientific scrutiny. I have had to work really, really hard to argue that point. If you're friends, if you're a 9/11 controlled demolition advocate, and they kind of avoid you, they don't want to go through the work that I just went through over all this time. But if I'm wrong, and again, anything is possible. A lot of people made fun of the people who were looking for gorillas in Africa, but finally somebody caught one and brought it back to England. And so, you know, that was just considered some crazy idea of us and people. But there is some hope. There are 2 things. Number 1, WikiLeaks and other organizations, and WikiLeaks is not the only one, there are others that are out there. Anybody could come by and give some really, really strong information. And a place like WikiLeaks would put that information out in a New York minute. Anyone can create a private blog. The cat is out of the bag. Government secrecy is getting more and more difficult. The other last hope is actually perhaps one of those wealthy movie stars that supports the position of 9/11 controlled demolition should be approached, and I'm very serious about this, to finance some really serious, honest-to-God, peer-reviewed studies of the thermitics in the dust. We've got to start here. Some of the experiments are not complete yet. We don't have really proof of the fluorine in the dust. They didn't use, they used regular air instead of nitrogen or argon as an example in that. And so, thermites are supposed to burn without oxygen. They failed to do that. That doesn't make the experiments completely invalid. It means you have to go back and have more studies, also to separate out the way that the chemical signatures that you see in the so-called thermitic dust versus the stuff that appears naturally in the towers and in the World Trade Center 7. So, in the meantime, for the rest of you, I wonder if you ever worry about the absolute absence of this physical evidence and the absolute absence of people to come forth directly. And I want to ask that I've given you now over 100 reasons why natural collapse makes sense. And I have to ask you, what would it take to make you satisfied with a natural collapse theory if that's not enough?
All right, Richard, your 4-minute summation, please.
As we have seen, the destruction of World Trade Center 7 shows all the characteristics of an explosive controlled demolition, a classic CD, a deceptive, engineered event with the use of incendiaries. The NIST report obfuscates and omits the critical evidence from the crime scene. It's a cover-up from beginning to end. And once again, my opponent is unable to account for the many physical impossibilities contained within it. We've shown that NIST grossly distorted the fire severity and duration. NIST fabricated a new phenomenon of thermal expansion to justify a fantastical tale of complete internal and external structural failure of a redundantly designed 47-story high-rise in just a dozen seconds. All due to the failure of a single column. NIST failed to conduct simple calculations or experiments to substantiate their theory. Instead, having been deprived of the benefit of directly observing the steel because of its illegal destruction, they relied upon animated computer models, which bear no resemblance to the observed collapse. Of course, we are denied access to the data inputs as well. NIST refuses to release such data requested via the Freedom of Information Act, claiming that its release would jeopardize public safety. In fact, the opposite of true is true, of course. Public safety is jeopardized by the withholding of this information from the architects and engineers who need to design buildings which don't free fall to the ground as a result of a few isolated pockets of fire. NIST refused to consider the most likely hypothesis of explosive controlled demolition, favoring their a priori assumed hypothesis of fire, even though fires never brought down a high-rise, and every high-rise that has been brought down by explosive controlled demolition. In fact, NIST does not explain the free fall of World Trade Center 7, which they had admitted to earlier. Nor have they acknowledged the obvious implication that the supporting structural columns had to have been removed virtually simultaneously. How can this be accomplished by fire? NIST neglected to test for thermite incendiaries in the debris, even though the National Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, NFPA 921, requires investigation of explosives given all the evidence of extreme temperatures not accounted for by office fires. Evidence like the dozens of credible reports of molten iron or steel in the debris pile, evidence like the critically important forensic documentation by FEMA in Appendix C of the only piece of Building 7 that was saved from its illegal destruction, melted steel beams, which NIST censored from their final report. In short, NIST's official technical explanation is inconsistent with the evidence and the basic laws of physics. By contrast, the hypothesis of explosive controlled demolition is consistent with all of the available evidence and the laws of physics. Under the prescription of the scientific method, we have no choice but to abandon the official account provided by NIST and to insist on a new investigation which accounts for all of the evidence, has subpoena power, where testimony is also taken under oath. After all, 9/11 was the precipitating event that sent us into two wars, in which already over 1 million people have perished. We must be absolutely certain about it. I call upon my opponent tonight and upon all Americans to join with the 1,450 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth in this historic cause. And I encourage you to review the evidence available on our DVDs and online at ae911truth.org, to sign our petition and put a strong voice to your conscience by speaking out to your friends, colleagues, government and media representatives. Act with courage today.
Well, this concludes our second segment. And what do you say about our two presenters? Certainly, they've put up a great presentation.
Thanks, you guys.
You have been listening to 9/11 Debate, Collapse by Fire or Explosive Controlled Demolition, featuring Chris Mohr and Richard Gage, AIA. This event was brought to you by Colorado 9/11 Visibility, colorado911visibility.org. Additional support provided by generous donations from our supporters, whom we gratefully thank.